Hello, and welcome to this clean, historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. A Healing Heart by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1. Baltimore, 1888. Make sure you wrap up well, Eve. It's chilly out there today, and I know you'll have your head in the clouds thinking about work and not even notice. Rosalie Wallace gave her eldest daughter a fond look and handed her a woolen shawl, which she accepted with an absent-minded nod. Dr. Jackson has promised to tell me more about his patients, Ma. Now that I've been working as his assistant for almost a year, he wants to give me a bigger role. Eve spooned the last of her porridge into her mouth, peering at the book which was propped up against the coffee pot in front of her. He's given me this book about diseases to read, for starters. I hope you're not going to ruin your eyesight, Noah Wallace muttered, taking a slurp of his coffee. You should be focusing on finding a suitable husband, not filling your head with all that nonsense. Eve shot her father a puzzled look. This is what I enjoy, Pa. I thought you'd be pleased. If I do well, I might even earn a bit more. Noah sighed loudly, as though Eve was simple-minded. Getting you taken off my hands with a husband is worth more than the few extra coins the doctor might deign to pay you one of these fine days. She's doing her best to contribute, Rosalie said in a meek voice. Eve works hard, from what I've heard folks say, and the Lord has blessed her with a gift for learning. She picked up Eve's empty bowl and took it to the sink in the corner of their modest kitchen, where a pail of water stood ready to wash the dishes. We're proud of you, Eve. Not many girls would be bold enough to knock on the doctor's door and ask for work the way you did. Quite right, too. It's not as if Eve can get by on her looks, is it? Noah sighed again, not noticing the shadow of hurt in Eve's eyes. How about I ask Dr. Jackson if he can raise my wages as soon as possible? Eve scrambled to her feet. Maybe I could do longer hours as well. That way I'll bring more money home and you'll be happier, Pa? Noah shrugged and nodded. If you can squeeze a few more cents out of that old skinflint, that would be good. Maybe one of his patients who ain't too bothered about how a girl looks might be happy to start courting you as well, he added thoughtfully. Noah, don't be so mean. She's our daughter. Don't you have a good word to say about her? Rosalie scrubbed the plates vigorously, feeling the familiar twist of irritation at her husband's careless words. Maybe someone who's blind, eh, Pa? Eve tied the shawl over her shoulders and brushed a kiss on her ma's cheek. If they can't see my birthmark, then they'd make the perfect husband. She chuckled in a self-deprecating manner as she uttered the words, but her pa's comments had stung, as they always did, even though she tried to make light of it. You're taking me wrong, Noah said defensively. You know I didn't mean it like that. It's just there's no point pretending you're a great beauty when you have a port wine-stained birthmark covering half your cheek for everyone to see. That's why I'm determined to do well from my book learning, instead. Eve shot back with a defiant tilt of her head. She snapped the book closed and tucked it under her arm. I might not be pretty, but I can better myself through what's in my mind, Pa. And nobody can think badly of me for that, she added under her breath. Be back in time for dinner, Rosalie called to her daughter's retreating back. What's he said this time? Eve's younger sister, Mabel, sat up in bed and rubbed the sleep from her eyes, watching Eve braid her hair and jam her bonnet on her head with a frustrated expression. Just the usual, Eve muttered. She looked at her sister in the mirror and gave her a grin. Maybe you should wait 5 minutes before you go and get your porridge. He might have left for work by then. Mabel held up her withered hand and looked at it dispassionately. I don't mind him being mean to the two of us, but when he blames Ma for the way we look, it makes my heart break for her. Eve perched on the edge of the bed she and Mabel shared and took hold of Mabel's disfigured hand. The skin was puckered, and she only had the thumb and 2 fingers. She had been born with it that way, and although their ma had said it was of no consequence, Noah had taken it as a personal affront that both of his daughters had visible differences from his high ideals of perfection which he had hoped for. Pa doesn't mean to be cruel with his words, Mabel. We have to remember that. He said he married Ma because she was a great beauty, and then it was a shock for him that both of his children didn't turn out the same way. She shrugged and pulled her sister into a hug. That's why you need to do well at school, she added. I'll never be as smart as you, Eve. Mabel swung her legs out of bed and wriggled out of her nightgown and into a plain calico dress as quickly as she could, shivering as the chilly air touched her skin. Of course you will, Eve chuckled. Just work hard and we'll be all right, you'll see. The pastor said that beauty is in the eye of the beholder anyway. We'll both get wed one day, in spite of what Pa believes. Chapter 2. As Eve hurried through the narrow back streets of Baltimore, she thought about the slurred words she had heard her pa say the night before when he had returned from his business meeting at the local saloon. I want to do well, Rosalie. I've got aspirations, but how can I ever get ahead if I have two unattractive spinsters for daughters? Her ma had paused, choosing her words carefully because it didn't take much to upset Noah when he'd been drinking hard liquor. Not everything comes down to looks, she had murmured. Eve has a quick mind and a way of caring for people that makes them appreciate her. And Mabel can sew better than many girls her age, no matter that her hand is deformed. We should be grateful that the Lord blessed us with two kind-hearted daughters, Noah. Many families aren't so lucky. Eve's heart had lifted at overhearing her ma's reply. She had gotten used to the sense that Noah was disappointed with his offspring. But her mother was their staunchest advocate, making up for their pa's frequently thoughtless comments that chipped away at their self-confidence. As long as we have Ma behind us and the Lord in our hearts, we'll never struggle alone, was what Eve often whispered to Mabel as they fell asleep. Eve heard the church bells chime the hour and quickened her pace, comforting herself of those words again as she turned the corner and saw Dr. Jackson's home come into sight. Her thoughts drifted back to when she had first started there. Dr. Jackson lived in an old house he had inherited from his parents, an elegant brownstone that had seen better days. Eve loved everything about it. When she had first plucked up the courage to knock on the door and ask for work, it had been after having a conversation with Agatha Blunell, his aging housekeeper, who had been scrubbing the steps and complaining bitterly to everyone passing about her arthritis. Eve had been on her way to the garment factory, where she hated working with a passion, and had seized the opportunity to ask Agatha whether Dr. Jackson might need more assistance. After a short interview, which had entailed Eve assuring the doctor that she was not squeamish and had a good eye for detail, along with Agatha saying repeatedly that it was high time someone younger should take on some of her tasks, Dr. Jackson had shaken her hand and told her to come at 8 o'clock sharp the following morning. It had been one of the happiest days of her life when Eve had handed in her notice at the factory and run home to tell her parents that she was now a physician's assistant. Almost a year later, Eve still felt a surge of gratitude that fate had put Agatha in her path, and she hurried up the steps, calling out a greeting as she let herself in. "Good morning, Eve. I have a busy morning going out to see patients." Dr. Jackson looked up from his microscope and gave her a warm smile as she tied a crisply starched apron over her dress. "I'll clean your treatment room and then make a start on your accounts," Eve replied. She bustled past him into the room, which held all the tools of his trade as a physician, with drawers full of instruments and shelves lined with bottles of medicine and pills. As always, she paused to inhale the stringent scent of carbolic and cast a proprietorial glance over everything, quickly deciding what needed her attention. She knew most people wouldn't understand her sense of pride every time she came to work, but to her, the smells and sights of the room represented order and a sense of significance. They became her safe haven, so that even though her face might cause people to stare and point when she was out and about, the work she was doing hidden away behind the scenes here at the doctor's house meant that in her own small way, she was helping the people of the neighborhood overcome the illnesses which were never far away. Eve rolled up her sleeves and set to work, scrubbing and polishing until everything gleamed. Next, she made a start on tidying so that everything was in its correct place, ready for any emergency that Dr. Jackson might have to attend. "I'm glad you're here, Eve. I swear the doctor might be good at saving lives, but he's the messiest man I ever did know." Agatha gave a nod of approval as she poked her head around the door. "He was out all night, tending to the poor souls who've succumbed to cholera." She made a sign of the cross over her ample bosom and shook her head sorrowfully. "'Tis like a tidal wave that keeps on comin' no matter how hard he works." Eve gave the housekeeper an understanding smile. "We just have to be grateful that he works so hard, Agatha. If it weren't for Dr. Jackson's ministrations to the poor, many of them would simply die." "Not that the wealthy folks care," Agatha continued with a disapproving sniff. "They let the poor folks suffer and leave the town in their droves until they think it's safe to return again." She shook her head and handed Eve a mug of coffee. "Get that down, you. It's going to be a long week. They say the worst of it is over, but I ain't so sure myself. It's in the hands of the Lord, and I've been praying extra every night that the better weather coming soon will dry the place up and get some fresh air through the town." The rest of the day passed uneventfully, and Eve soon had the accounts neatly done in the heavy ledger before toiling over the copper washpot in the scullery to boil the doctor's clothes and bedsheets. It was a new idea, which he insisted might help reduce the spread of the wretched disease that was claiming so many lives. The sun was low in the sky as Eve walked home. She fingered the coins in her pocket, which Dr. Jackson had given her as an unexpected bonus from payment received from one of his wealthier patients. Her stomach rumbled with hunger, and she decided to buy 2 hot pies to take home for their dinner. Her ma had seemed tired in the last few days, worn down by the strains of everyday life, and Eve thought it would cheer her up to have a nice ham pie to enjoy instead of the thin stew that was a staple of their evening dinners. Taking the longer route home, Eve pulled her bonnet lower over her face as she turned into the market square. The last costermongers were jostling and shouting loudly, trying to sell their final few handfuls of vegetables to the passing clerks and factory workers as they trudged home. It wasn't that she was ashamed of the wine-colored mark that looked like an ink splash across her cheek, but she had never really gotten used to being stared at. She was naturally shy and hated being the center of attention. Most of the locals who knew her didn't give her a second glance, but it had become second nature for Eve to pull her golden blonde curls over her cheeks slightly and hide beneath her bonnet. "There you go, Eve. Have this on us. Dr. Jackson helped my cousin last night, and he's feeling a lot better now. I know you work hard keeping everything in order at that old house of his." The store owner popped an extra pie in Eve's basket with a grateful smile. "I thought we'd escaped cholera in this neighborhood, but I've heard several people have got it now. It's a bad state of affairs, I tell you." Eve thanked the jovial woman and waved goodbye, deciding to buy a cabbage as well from Mr. Crow, her favorite costermonger, with her final coins. With a bit of care, they would be able to make the food last an extra day, which she knew would help ease her ma's mind against the never-ending worry of keeping the family well fed. "Well, don't you look like a pretty young thing?" A blast of warm air wafted out from the saloon, bringing 2 drunks with it, and Eve stepped out into the road to avoid them, narrowly missing a rumbling cart passing by. Turning away to avoid their lecherous gaze, she tried to push past, but they blocked her route, grinning lazily. "Why such a rush, ma'am? Ain't you got time to give me a bit of attention?" The taller one of the 2 stepped closer, his gaze raking up and down Eve's figure, pausing where her sensible dress hugged her womanly curves. "I must get home, sir. If you could just let me pass, please." Eve lowered her eyes, but the man snatched at her wrist. "Won't you let me enjoy your company? It's rude to turn down my generosity, ain't it?" The man turned to his friend, who stuck his thumbs in his waistcoat and nodded enthusiastically. "My pa is expecting me home," Eve said more firmly. She lifted her head and gave them a defiant stare, knowing exactly what would happen next. As if on cue, the man recoiled, dropping her hand as though she had slapped him. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her face, and his smile turned into a snarl of contempt. "I ain't interested in you now. Not with that mark on your face," he growled, full of frustration. "You shouldn't tease a man in such a way with your pretty figure." He slung his arm over his friend's shoulder, and the two of them weaved their way off down the street as Eve sighed with relief. "I guess there are some benefits to some people being shocked when they see my face." The thought brought a sad smile to her face as she continued home. As much as she told herself she could better herself through her book learning, sometimes Eve yearned for a kind-hearted man to see all of her, including her face, and gaze upon her with eyes full of love instead of shock. As she walked the last few streets and her home came into view, she wondered disconsolately whether she would ever find a man like that, or if it would only ever be an unreachable dream. Chapter 3. Mabel riddled the fire and added a couple of lumps of coal before pulling her chair closer to the hearth and resuming the sewing she had already started as Eve pored over another one of the doctor's books in the weak light from the lamp. A clock ticked soothingly on the mantel shelf, and Noah dozed in his armchair. They had lived in the narrow brick house for almost 10 years. Moving from the rough tenement where Eve had been born when Noah had been promoted at the shipping company where he worked as a clerk. Although it was a challenge paying the rent every month, Noah was insistent that it was important for a man of his standing to be seen to be going up in the world. He had been delighted to leave the crime-ridden neighborhood they had started married life in without so much as a backward glance, even though Rosalie still missed their friends. "Let me make a start on our mending while you do that," Rosalie whispered, perching next to Mabel. She selected one of Noah's shirts from the mending pile and threaded her needle to make a start on turning the frayed collar. If she was careful, it would last another year, which would be one less thing to find money for. "Mrs. Bobbin said she's got plenty more work she can give me." Mabel's needle flew in and out of the hem of the sumptuous blue gown on her lap, and the tip of her tongue poked out in concentration. "It's lucky she's got more work than she can take care of," Eve commented. "I've never known a dressmaker as busy as her. Every time I pass her house, there's a smart carriage waiting outside with a new customer." "The best thing is that when you're old enough, you'll probably be able to start your own little business, Mabel. She told me you're the best seamstress she has." Rosalie's eyes shone with pride as she looked at the practically invisible stitches Mabel had done to take up a taffeta gown for a lady who was traveling to England to join her husband. Suddenly, the peaceful evening was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, and Rosalie jumped up again and hurried along the hallway. "Are we expecting visitors?" Eve asked Mabel. She had hoped to spend the whole evening reading. Noah's eyes flicked open. He yawned loudly, and his expression brightened as he heard a tinkling laugh. "That must be Mrs. Demire. I passed her on my way home, and we got to talking. I think she's lonely since her husband died." He jumped up and smoothed his hair down. "Don't just sit there, Eve. Fetch a couple of glasses. I expect she would like some of Ma's lemonade." Eve closed her book and hurried to their kitchen to do as her father had asked. She didn't much like Suzanne Demire, who lived a few doors down the street, but her late husband had worked as a manager in the shipping company, and Noah had always taken great care to be friendly with them, telling Rosalie it would help his chances of another promotion. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, dear." Suzanne Demire flicked Rosalie a quick smile and swept past her, not waiting for an answer. "Your husband is such a gentleman. He knows how much I miss my dear Egbert since his sad demise. The evenings are long when I'm all alone." Her voice trembled with emotion, and Noah jumped forward to take her fur stole from her. "You must never be lonely, Suzanne. Not when we're here to keep you company. Isn't that right, Rosalie?" He ushered her to his armchair and sat down opposite her. "Of course," Rosalie said hastily. "I can't imagine how lonesome you must feel without him, Suzanne. You must miss him terribly. You'll have some lemonade, and we can chat by the fire." She moved the mending pile, and Suzanne gave another tinkling laugh. "Don't stop your work on my behalf." She took a sip of lemonade and leaned forward to look at what Mabel was doing. "What a lovely gown, and you're so clever sewing like that, even with that poor hand of yours. Such a shame." Suzanne's nose wrinkled delicately as she averted her gaze quickly from Mabel's hand and gave Noah a smile instead. You must tell me how everything is going at Bay Shipping, Noah. I miss hearing about it since Egbert died. Lord rest his soul. Nothing much has changed, Noah replied. They're opening up a new part of the business at the New York docks. But I expect you already knew that? Suzanne nodded. My Egbert was very much hoping to secure a position there. It would have suited me very well to move to New York. There's far more happening down there than in this dreary backwater. You never know who you might meet. Royalty, theater stars. It's definitely the place to be for anyone with a shred of ambition. I'd rather stay here, Rosalie murmured. Wouldn't you have missed all your friends if you'd moved? Suzanne darted her a look of amusement. Staying in the town where you were born is such a quaint notion, Rosalie. Egbert outgrew this place long ago. It's just a shame he never had the chance to prove himself in New York. He was tipped to rise even higher in the company, you know. I admired that about him, Noah said, giving Suzanne a smile of understanding. A man who wanted to get ahead. That's what I'm always trying to tell my family. But, well, it seems to fall on deaf ears. He gave Rosalie a disappointed look and chuckled as he glanced back at Suzanne. They tell me being a clerk is something to be proud of, but I want more. Egbert understood me perfectly well. Suzanne leaned forward and patted Noah's hand before turning a smile on Rosalie. This lemonade is very good. And you're quite right, Rosalie. Getting a promotion isn't everything. I'm sure Eve and Mabel will find two nice young men to settle down with if they're not too choosy, and you can stay here, living a nice little life where everyone knows you. Although Eve thought Suzanne's description sounded like just how she imagined their lives would be, there was something about the woman's tone that made it seem dull, and not something that she would ever wish for herself. Well, it suits us perfectly fine, doesn't it, Noah? Rosalie said stoutly. And I won't let my girls marry just anyone, you know. Eve is already doing marvelously working for Dr. Jackson, and Mabel will likely have her own dressmaking business. They'll have their pick of the best suitors when the time comes. I'm sure of it. She folded her hands in her lap, but the two spots of pink on her cheeks told Eve that her ma had taken offense at Suzanne's assumption that they would struggle to find a husband. Of course, and how admirable that Dr. Jackson has taken you under his wing, Eve. Maybe he might take you as a wife, perhaps? It would certainly suit him well to have someone who is happy to be surrounded by all that disease and being out at all hours dealing with the worst of people's ailments. Suzanne shuddered slightly. I know he's 3 times your age, coming up to being 60, I believe, but obviously he doesn't mind about your. She gestured at Eve's face as her words petered out. I'm working for Dr. Jackson, that's all, Eve replied hastily. We're not courting, it's a professional relationship. He's a very clever man and he's going to teach me about his patients and all manner of useful things. How charming, Suzanne said faintly. Although it's not the sort of work a young lady would normally do, I suppose it doesn't really matter in your case. I'm sure Noah must be very proud of you. She yawned daintily and stood up. I won't keep you any longer, but I will call again if that's all right. It gives me so much pleasure reminiscing about Egbert with you, Noah. Our home is always open for you, Suzanne. Noah jumped up and escorted her to the door, draping her fur stole over her shoulders. It's nice to talk to someone who appreciates ambition. I only wish I could get a promotion and move to New York, he added wistfully. Never mind, it's not to be. Eve caught Mabel's eye and grimaced as they heard the front door close. Do we still need to be friends with her now that Mr. Demere has passed away? I never like the way she speaks to you, Ma, as if you're somehow beneath her. Hush now, Eve. That's not a very neighborly way to speak, is it? I raised you better than that. Rosalie reached for her mending again and pressed her lips together, not wanting to say anything more about it. Eve shrugged and started making some notes from her book, but it didn't escape her notice that Noah looked decidedly chirpy after the unexpected visit. She felt a ripple of pity for her ma that Suzanne had such an effect. It seemed to her that their neighbor didn't even realize how flirtatious she was being toward Noah, fawning over him, with her late husband scarcely cold in his grave. Chapter 4. The following morning, Eve woke early and made a start on cooking the porridge. Dr. Jackson had promised that he would let her sit in on some of the patient consultations once her regular jobs had been done, and she had already lain awake for an hour, wondering what various ailments people might have. He had warned her that it would most likely be a stream of malingerers and minor illnesses, but it didn't dim her excitement. The fact that he was willing to discuss his cases with her and explain how he was treating his patients felt like a huge gesture of faith in her abilities, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride as she stirred the wooden spoon in the pan, waited for the porridge to thicken. "You're up early." Rosalie bustled into the kitchen, rubbing her hands together. "I can't get warm this morning," she added. Eve poured a mug of coffee out and handed it to her. "Why don't you sit down and let me take care of breakfast, Ma?" She pulled a chair closer to the range and guided Rosalie to it so she could benefit from what little heat there was, noticing how tired she looked. "I was thinking about what Suzanne said last night. Perhaps it's time for you to start walking out with someone." Eve pulled a face and shook her head. "The local gentlemen aren't exactly queuing at the door, Ma. I'm only 20, and I'd rather live at home with you and Pa so I can take care of you." Rosalie took a sip of the coffee and grimaced slightly. "Did you use fresh water from the pump for this? It tastes a little strange to me." She took another sip and put the mug to one side. Before Eve had a chance to answer, Mabel and Noah came into the kitchen, and she ladled out porridge for everyone, eating hers as fast as she could. "I'm not sure what time I'll be home this evening. It depends if Dr. Jackson has to go out to see patients who can't come to his house." Her mouth lifted in a grin. "He might even let me go out on some visits with him." "Are you sure that's wise? I'm not sure I like the idea of you gallivanting around town with the doctor. It might set tongues wagging." Noah perched his spectacles on the end of his nose and shook out an old newspaper, turning to the business section. Eve looked deflated and Rosalie gave her a small nod. "Your Pa is right, Eve. It's one thing to be at his house with Agatha there, but I don't think you should be riding around Baltimore in the doctor's carriage with him without a chaperone. It wouldn't be proper." "All right, but he wouldn't do anything untoward, Ma. He's far too busy caring for the sick to think about such things." "Better safe than sorry," Mabel piped up. "Besides, you heard what Mrs. Demere said about how your work isn't what most young ladies do." She gave her sister a mischievous grin and fluttered her eyelashes. "You should be at home curling your hair instead." Eve chuckled and drained her coffee cup. "In that case, dear Mabel, you can clear up the breakfast things so I can get to work early. Ma's looking tired, and it's about time you helped out more instead of daydreaming about romance." With one final grin, she swung her shawl over her shoulders and hurried away before Mabel could complain. Dr. Jackson handed a bottle of tincture to the harried-looking woman in his office and gave her a kindly smile. "There's nothing wrong with your son other than the usual infant ailments. Give him this tonic, and if he becomes feverish, call me out immediately." The woman nodded and hitched her son higher in her arms, standing up to leave. "It ain't the cholera then, Dr. Jackson? I've been fretting all night long that he might die, especially since I heard there's so much of it about." "No, ma'am. His high temperature is simply from teething, I believe. My ma swore by letting my sister chew on her rattle to help her teeth come through," Eve said quietly. She gave the new mother a sympathetic look. "It's hard for you, especially when it's your first baby and everything is new. Try not to worry. Otherwise, your baby will pick up on your nerves and get fretful. You're doing everything right. Just remember that." The woman smiled, and her expression filled with relief. "That's kind of you to say so, miss. My husband works all hours, and I don't have any other family I can turn to for help. I kept thinking I was getting everything wrong, and I was so worried." She fumbled in her pocket and pulled a coin out. "Use that to buy a hot dinner," Dr. Jackson said. "You can't look after your baby properly if you're not eating." He held the door open, and Eve ushered her out amid another flurry of thanks from her. She watched the woman hurry away and felt a glow of satisfaction that she seemed happier than when she had first arrived. "You're very good with the patients, Eve." Dr. Jackson tidied away his instruments and gave her a shrewd look from under his bushy gray eyebrows. The women seem to find your presence reassuring, which makes them more willing to explain what is troubling them. I think you should join me more often in the consultations, if you'd like to, that is. Oh, yes, please, doctor. It has been the best afternoon I've ever had. There's so much for me to try and understand, though. The doctor chuckled. Try and learn something new every day, Eve. That's what my teachers used to say to me when I was studying to become a physician. He pointed to a stack of books that he had taken down from his shelves. Work through these, one at a time. It might take you many years, but I think you have the makings of a good doctor's assistant. Well, until you get married and have to stop, of course. He coughed to cover his embarrassment at talking about something outside of work. Don't worry about that, Eve replied hastily. I'm not courting anyone, and this is what I enjoy. I'll be grateful to work for you for as long as possible, Dr. Jackson. Thank you for giving me the chance. Eve felt as though she was walking on air all the way home. Her mind whirled as she tried to remember all the medical terms the doctor had used and the explanations he had given her after each patient had left, so she could understand why he had made each decision. Ma, I've had the best day ever! Eve closed the front door with a bang and burst into the kitchen, eager to tell her family every detail of her day, but stopped in her tracks as she saw Mabel sitting at the table, as white as a ghost. What is it? Eve demanded. What's wrong? It's Ma, Mabel whispered. I was just about to come and find you, but I didn't know whether to leave her. Eve turned around to rush upstairs, but Mabel grabbed her arm. She's been vomiting for the last hour and crying out with the pain in her legs. Her words hung in the air, and tears pooled in her eyes. You know what that means. Cholera. The words came out of Eve's mouth in a croak, and she felt her legs start to tremble. Ma's got cholera, and from what you're saying, it's bad. She snatched up her shawl again. Don't go into her room. I don't want you to catch it. Mabel nodded mutely, feeling helpless. I'll run as fast as I can. Boil water ready and get clean sheets from the linen press. We just have to pray that Dr. Jackson can save her. Chapter 5. Clearsprings, Oregon. Ann Penn hobbled out onto the veranda and handed her husband Frank a coffee before sitting down next to him on their new wooden bench. He sipped the dark, fragrant drink appreciatively, and they both looked out across the paddock in front of them. It had been a long winter, but a warm wind had blown through Oregon over the last few weeks, and finally, the first green shoots of spring were showing. Well, Anne, I reckon we should be grateful we survived to see another turn of the seasons, don't you? Frank gave his wife of over 40 years a gentle smile and patted her hand in a gesture that was as unconscious as breathing. Of course we did. We've got plenty more years left in us yet, Frank. Anne shook her head and smiled into his faded blue eyes. She was always surprised when his thoughts turned maudlin, although she should have known to expect it. They had been hoping to see both their sons happily married by now, but fate had had other ideas, and she knew it was a worry that kept Frank awake in the darkest hours of the night. As if reading her thoughts, Frank sighed and drained the last of his coffee. Do you think we should tell Jake and Gabriel what we talked about last night? Is it too soon? He lifted his battered hat and placed it over his sparse, gray hair before struggling to his feet. Anne looked at the mottled sunspots on the face that was so dear to her and nodded quickly. I'll make their favorite stew, and you tell them we need a family meeting tonight. We can't bury our heads in the sand any longer. Across on the far side of the paddock, Jake and Gabriel worked in unison, unaware of what their parents were discussing. Hold him tight. You know they always try and wriggle out of it. Jake tried to keep the frustration out of his voice as his brother struggled to pin the young steer against the fence rails. Have you got him good and tight? He grunted. Yeah, do it now. Gabriel tightened his grip as Jake pressed the red-hot branding iron on the animal's haunch for a few seconds before releasing him. With a kick of his hooves, the steer darted away, sending up a cloud of dust as Gabriel grabbed the next animal to repeat the process. The The sun was still low in the sky as the brothers had been working since before daybreak, and half an hour later, Gabriel pushed his hat to the back of his head and wiped the sweat off his brow with a grin. "Are we done? I'd better go and get cleaned up. I don't want to put my customers off by smelling like I've been wrestling in the muck." Jake thumped his brother on the arm with a good-natured smile. "You never know. The women of Clearsprings might find it appealing, Gabe. Better than smelling like carbolic soap, huh? I'm not looking for a woman, Jake. You know that." Gabriel started walking back toward the log cabin. "I've had my fill of heartache," he added, looking back over his shoulder. "You'll stay clear of them, too, if you know what's good for you." Jake watched his brother hurrying away with a rueful expression. In many ways, he knew that Gabriel was right and only had his best interests in mind, but he still yearned for Vanessa. He closed his eyes for a moment and conjured an image of the woman he should have married a few months ago, until it had all come to an abrupt halt when she told him she had changed her mind without any further explanation. Even now, he couldn't fathom why she had switched from being the warm, caring fiancée he couldn't wait to build a life with, to the uncaring person she seemed to have become overnight. She hadn't even told him in person that the wedding was off, choosing instead to leave a note for him at the boarding house she was staying at. "I can't explain why we can't marry. You just have to trust that it's for the best." The words were still burned into his memory, and it was the not knowing that had eaten away at him, making him wonder what he had done wrong. Gabriel had been unlucky in love as well. He had been betrothed to marry a sweet young woman from the next town, but tragically, she had died from influenza. What had made it even harder for Gabriel to accept was that he was an apothecary. "I should have been able to save her," he had muttered over and over again in the dark days following her death. "What's the point of me healing people when I couldn't even help the woman I loved?" For a while, Jake had wondered whether Gabriel would give up the job that he had worked so hard for, but they had managed to persuade him not to do anything rash. Over time, Gabriel had rediscovered his passion for healing the sick and helping those who were unwell to get better, but he had built a wall around his heart, determined to never again go through the pain of losing someone so close. "What a pair we are, huh, Blade?" The horse's ears flicked forward at hearing his master's voice, and Jake unhitched the reins and swung himself up into the saddle in one fluid movement. "Gabe's sworn off love forever, and I can't find anyone to take Vanessa's place, even though she's been gone almost a year, and I should move on." He squeezed his legs, and the horse broke into a steady lope so he could go and check the stock on the far side of the ranch, where the meadows sloped down to the lake. As Jake worked methodically along their boundary line, checking the fence and counting their cattle to make sure none had gone astray, his thoughts turned to the future. Even though he still had feelings for Vanessa, he was starting to feel a glimmer of something that felt a lot like getting over her. He had to be practical. Although Clearsprings was a bustling frontier town, single women were few and far between. A flirtatious redhead had caught his attention the last time he'd gone out to Murphy's saloon for a few whiskeys, but before he'd had a chance to talk to her, a thick-set man he recognized from the mine had linked arms with her, whisking her away with a glint in his eye. Lately, he had found the long evenings at the ranch with just his studious brother and elderly parents for company left him wanting more. An image of Vanessa's coppery curls and amber eyes floated into his mind again, and he kicked a stone with the toe of his boot, trying to banish the way her eyes had crinkled when she laughed from his memory. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the lake which lay below. The water rippled in the early spring breeze, and he felt a swell of pride at how well their cattle looked. He wished again that Gabriel could have chosen to work on the ranch with him, but it was a fool's errand. Gabe had been born with a disease that affected his muscles, meaning he would never be strong enough to labor all day outside like he did. To meet him, you wouldn't know there was anything wrong with him, but Jake had seen the way a couple of hours. Work on the ranch could leave him exhausted for days afterward. Instead, their parents had encouraged him to study, and Jake was glad that Gabe had found his calling as an apothecary, even though he was struggling to manage the ranch now that their pa was getting so old. A rumble of wheels made him look up, and he was surprised to see their wagon trundling toward him, pulled by Floss, who was their oldest horse. Anne smiled down at him as she pulled Floss to a stop. "Your pa and I thought we'd have a drive around the ranch, seeing as the weather's good." She handed Jake a basket covered by a gingham cloth. "I knew you would forget about taking some food, so I made you something." "Thanks, Ma." Jake pulled out 2 thick slices of bread, sandwiching cheese and pickle between them, and bit into it, suddenly realizing how hungry he was. "I'm making oxtail stew for dinner," Anne continued. "Figured it was time we all sat down to talk about the future. Don't be late home." Before Jake had time to reply, she flicked the reins, and Floss plodded away, leaving him wondering what there was to discuss. Life had fallen into a predictable pattern where he would work the ranch with his pa's help for as long as he was able to give it, and Gabriel would work at the apothecary. And God willing, he might see the mysterious redhead at the saloon again soon and pluck up the courage to introduce himself. Chapter 6. Clearsprings, Oregon. "How was work today, son?" Anne ladled some stew into a bowl and passed it to Gabriel, along with some cornbread. "Oh, the usual. Coughs and colds, sprains to bandage up, and Mrs. Finley insisting that her eyesight is getting worse, even though she can still read the signs in my window from across the road." Gabriel chuckled as he shared tidbits of gossip from his day, knowing that his ma liked to hear how everyone was doing. Although there were always new folks arriving in Clearsprings to settle out west, they still knew most people in the town, and it was a close-knit community. "Any nice young ladies arriving on the train?" Frank lifted his eyebrows, glancing at Jake. "I did notice several, but then they got on the stagecoach to head onward out of town," Gabriel replied with a shrug. "The sheriff came in to tell me there are cattle rustlers working on the other side of Trout Creek Ridge, so you'd better keep a lookout, Jake. He said they hope to catch 'em in the next few days. But you never know." "They're pretty brazen," he said. Anne sat down, and the 4 of them folded their hands in prayer as Frank gave thanks for their food before they all started eating. For a few moments, the only sound in the room was the crackle of wood on the fire and the rhythmic tick of the clock on the mantel shelf, as well as the quiet purring of Anne's tabby cat as she snoozed on the back of her armchair. Anne cleared her throat and gave Frank a small nod. "Your pa and I have something we'd like to talk about." Gabriel stopped eating with his spoon midair. "Not bad news, I hope?" "No, well, not really." Frank shifted uncomfortably. "It's just that your ma and I aren't getting any younger. We know things haven't worked out for you, you know." "What he means is that we were hoping you would both have been married by now," Anne said hastily, helping her husband out. "The future of Sunnybrook Ranch depends on there being a next generation to take over. Gabe, we know that you can't do too much hard laboring, and nor would we want you to." "I can get by all right, Ma," Jake interjected. "Maybe a bit of help from one of the neighbors' ranch hands now and again wouldn't go amiss, but we'll be fine. I don't expect Pa to work much, not now his health is failing." "It's not just the work, son. We want to see you happily married, with children of your own." Anne gave Frank a fond look. "We've been together over 40 years, and it hasn't always been easy, but God blessed us with 2 wonderful sons. We've been praying you might have the same, but all the nice young ladies seem to be spoken for." "It's not for want of looking, Ma," Jake joked. "Gabe keeps his eye on the new arrivals for me." "I'm not interested at the moment, Ma," Gabriel said gently. "My work keeps me busy. That's good enough for me." Anne took another mouthful of stew before putting her spoon down again. "When I was in town last week at the mercantile store, I bumped into Elizabeth Lawrence. Now, I know you tell me not to interfere, but she was adamant that there are some wonderful young ladies coming out west in response to her advertisements." "Meh, we talked about this, didn't we?" Jake sighed with frustration and rolled his eyes to show he meant no offense. "I don't want to marry a woman I've never even met before. Elizabeth's matrimonial agency might suit some people, but not me." "Just listen to your ma, please," Frank interjected. "The fact is, Vanessa has gone, and we know you're lonesome, son. It's only natural. Won't you at least consider it?" And you can't mourn Lucy's passing forever, Gabriel. The Lord wouldn't want that, and we don't either. Gabriel shook his head vehemently. It's not for me, Pa. I'm sorry. Maybe one day I'll meet someone, but not at the moment. And you, Jake? Anne gave her younger son a steadfast look. Even if you just place an advertisement and decide not to take it any further, what have you got to lose? Elizabeth said you could correspond over several months to get to know a young lady if one takes your interest. Jake could feel his resolve weakening as he thought about another long, lonely evening looming, just like every other one stretching ahead over the coming weeks and months. He imagined taking a stroll on a summer's evening down by the lake with someone special on his arm and came to a sudden decision. All right, I suppose I could just place an advertisement and see if I get any replies, as long as you won't be disappointed if I decide not to pursue it. He added hastily as Anne clapped her hands with delight. Of course not, son, but I know you're doing the right thing, and once Gabe sees how successful it is, maybe he'll follow suit. Steady on, Ma. Let's wait and see how Jake gets on, shall we? I'm not at all sure about folks finding a bride this way, but if he's come around to the idea, I won't stand in his way. Gabriel was shocked that his brother had agreed and hoped it wouldn't end up being a terrible mistake. I've got a good feeling about this, Anne replied, brushing his concerns away. Her eyes twinkled with excitement at the thought of two delightful new daughters-in-law joining their family, and she decided to go and tell Elizabeth the good news the following morning. All being well, they might even have their first grandchild before too much longer, and she squeezed Frank's hand under the table as they shared a secret smile between themselves. Chapter 7. Baltimore. Eve reached for Mabel's hand as they stood looking at the simple headstone. She could still scarcely believe their beloved Ma was gone, taken far too soon by cholera. Although Dr. Jackson had come as fast as he could, there was nothing that could be done, and Rosalie had succumbed to the terrible disease within days. Bless you, Ma. You're with the Lord now. Mabel dabbed away her tears with the corner of her apron and placed a small posy of flowers on her grave. The two of them tried to visit every week, and it gave Eve a crumb of comfort that Mabel was starting to get over her initial grief, and they could remember the many happy moments they had enjoyed with their Ma instead. The late spring sunshine was warm as they walked back home, and Mabel picked a sprig of blossom and tucked it into her shawl. I'm glad school is over, she said with a little skip. I'm learning so much more now that I'm working for Mrs. Bobbin, even though it's my first week. And I know I won't earn much, but it all helps, doesn't it? Eve nodded. It certainly does. Pa was fretting about losing the few coins Ma made each week from taking in mending, but I reckon if we're careful, we'll be fine. They turned the corner on their street, and her heart sank as she saw Suzanne just about to knock on their door. Ah, there you are, girls. Suzanne gave them a brief smile before turning the full force of her charm back to Noah, who had answered her knock. I brought this for you, Noah, dear. She gestured at the jug of lemonade in her hand. I know how much you enjoyed it when I made some for you before. It's such a nice thing we can enjoy together as two lonely neighbors, don't you agree? Before Noah could reply, Suzanne had tucked her other hand in his arm and given it a sympathetic squeeze. Shall we go inside? It's important that you don't cut yourself off from your friends, Noah. I mean, it's sad that Rosalie died, of course, but I'm here to comfort you. The two of them went through to the small parlor, and Eve felt a hard knot of resentment in her chest. Their Ma had scarcely been buried for more than a few weeks, and Suzanne was already insinuating herself into their lives. The worst thing was that Noah seemed to be lapping up the attention, hanging on her every word, especially when she insisted that he could do so much better for himself at Bay Shipping. As if on cue, Eve could hear Suzanne launching into her favorite subject again as she fetched some glasses from the kitchen. I just know it would be right for you, Noah. Egbert used to tell me your talents were wasted as a lowly clerk. A man of your standing should be much higher up with more responsibility and pay. Here are the glasses, Pa. Eve put the tray down on the occasional table hard enough to make the glasses rattle, and Noah gave her an irritated glance. Don't be so clumsy, Eve. Really, I don't know what's gotten into you lately. Aren't you going to pour the lemonade out for Suzanne? Where are your manners?" Suzanne gave him a coy smile. "You're so thoughtful, Noah." She took her drink from Eve with a small nod of thanks. "What I really wanted to tell you is that I've had a word with one of Egbert's old colleagues, and he thinks there could be a better job becoming available for you as a manager." "Really?" Noah's mouth gaped open for a moment before he grasped Suzanne's hand and held it to his chest, looking deep into her eyes. "You did that for me? Is there anything else I can get you?" Eve said loudly, making Suzanne jump. She felt a hot flush of annoyance at the expression on Noah's face and the way his eyes shone when he looked at Suzanne. "I think a bit of privacy would be nice," Suzanne purred, waving her hand dismissively. "Your father and I have things to discuss which aren't for your ears. I expect you and Mabel have some chores you should be getting on with." "You don't want to let standards slip. Dear Noah deserves better than that." Eve stalked out of the room and spent the next hour clattering loudly in the kitchen preparing their evening meal, while Mabel sat in the corner sewing. "It's not right," Eve muttered. "Pa's like a different man every time she comes round. It's as if Ma meant nothing to him." "Maybe they're both just lonely," Mabel replied, trying to think the best of the situation as she usually did. "Well, it's too soon, as far as I'm concerned," Eve harumphed. "She speaks to me as though I'm a servant." A terrible thought suddenly came into her mind. "You don't think she will try and take Ma's place, do you? I couldn't imagine anyone worse." No sooner were the words out of her mouth than Noah's cheery cry drifted down the hallway. "Eve, Mabel, can you come and join us, please? We have some good news to share with you." Mabel's face blanched as Eve gasped. "Surely not. It must be something to do with Pa's work, that's all." "Well, we'd better go and see, I suppose." Eve tried to arrange her face into a neutral expression as they slipped into the parlor. Suzanne was holding Noah's hand and she shot the two girls a triumphant smile. "I know this might be quicker than you'd thought it might happen, but I've asked Suzanne to be my wife." Noah raised Suzanne's hand to his lips and kissed the back of it. "It's not as if we didn't know each other very well already, after all, and we have so much in common, there's no point waiting." Suzanne simpered as he kissed her hand again. "I know we're going to get along so well, girls. I shall do everything I can to make your dear father very happy." Eve felt as though the words had got stuck in her throat until she felt a sharp jab from Mabel's elbow. "Oh, congratulations," she stuttered. She blinked back the sudden hot tears that pricked at the back of her eyes. "Welcome to our home," she added. "I'm sure you'll hardly know I'm here, girls," Suzanne said joyfully. "The first thing will be to finally help you get the career you deserve," she added, turning back to Noah. "I'm going to speak to Egbert's friend again. I can be very persuasive, you know. I'm sure you'll get that new position at Bay Shipping in no time." Chapter 8. Baltimore. The next few weeks slipped by, and in spite of Eve's reservations, Noah seemed delighted with his new situation. The marriage had taken place within days, and Suzanne had moved all her worldly belongings into their home, consigning everything that had been Rosalie's to a chest at the back of the closet. "I really don't like the way your clothes smell when you get back from Dr. Jackson's," Suzanne said one evening, wrinkling her nose as she walked into the kitchen where Eve was peeling potatoes. "Maybe you should hang them outside as soon as you get home." "It's just the carbolic soap," Eve mumbled. "Pa's never complained about it before." "That's neither here nor there, Eve. It displeases me, and I'd rather you did as I ask." Suzanne sniffed again and folded her arms, watching Eve. "Noah and I will eat at the table in the parlor tonight. I'm sure you and Mabel would rather stay in the kitchen. Besides, we need some time alone without you two constantly wanting to talk about the past." Mabel looked up from her sewing in surprise. "Are you sure? Pa always likes to hear about what we've been doing at work. Mrs. Bobbin is teaching me how to make a new gown all by myself for." "He's not really interested, dear," Suzanne interjected, cutting Mabel's words off mid-sentence. "I mean, a little sewing job and tidying up after Dr. Jackson, it's hardly on Noah's intellectual level, is it? I'm glad you both have something to occupy yourselves until I can find husbands for you, but it's high time you let your father give more of his time and attention to me as his wife." She tutted and swept back out of the room as though Eve and Mabel were of no consequence. What did she mean about finding us a husband? Eve's cheeks had turned pink as she tried to digest Suzanne's words. And how dare she be so rude about our work? Ma was always so proud of us. It's just not fair how Suzanne is turning Pa against us. Let's try not to get too upset by it, Mabel said with a long sigh. I expect it's just because she's nervous about trying to find her place in the family, especially as it's so soon after Pa was widowed. Eve chopped an onion and put it into the pan, pushing the window open to stop her eyes from watering as the pungent smell wafted up. You're far more charitable than me, Mabel. I think Suzanne has had designs on Pa ever since her own poor husband died, and now we're stuck with her. She stirred the beginnings of her stew absent-mindedly. She can't make us marry against our wills, though, she added. Her expression brightened. Anyway, tell me everything about your day at Mrs. Bobbin's. It sounds to me as though you're going to become a wonderful dressmaker if she's already letting you make a gown by yourself. Over the next few days, the family settled into a new rhythm. Eve and Mabel did all the household chores as soon as they returned home from work before eating together in the kitchen. And Suzanne and Noah retreated into the parlor for the evening as soon as Noah got home from his day at Bay Shipping, emerging only to ask Eve to make the coffee or to bring them more coal for the fire. Eve thought wistfully back to the hours she and Mabel had sat in front of the hearth in the parlor with their ma, reading, sewing, and making plans for the future together. She felt a sudden ache of loss as Suzanne's shrill voice summoned her yet again to do something for her. Eve, is dinner ready yet? Dear Noah has worked so hard this week. He shouldn't be kept waiting. You could have started cooking before I got back from the doctor's, Eve muttered under her breath as she started putting the sliced meat and vegetables onto their plates. She wondered what Suzanne did all day. It seemed to involve a lot of meeting up with people in town, which she claimed was vital for Noah's progress at work. I'll carry the lemonade and glasses. Mabel put her sewing to one side and stretched before hastily pouring out a jug of lemonade. The two sisters hurried to the parlor, where Suzanne and Noah sat expectantly at the small dining table in the window. Eve was surprised to see that they already had 2 glasses of ruby port poured out, and Suzanne's face was wreathed in smiles. We're celebrating, aren't we, dear? She said as she saw Eve's quizzical glance. We certainly are, my love. Noah took a sip of his port and clasped Suzanne's hand, gazing into her eyes as though Eve and Mabel weren't even there. It's been like a breath of fresh air marrying you. I don't know how I'll ever be able to thank you enough for what you've done. This is a wonderful new beginning for us, my sweet. What do you mean? Mabel blurted out. She angled herself between them and poured the lemonade as Eve put the food in front of them. Suzanne has been working tirelessly to help my progress at Bay Shipping, Mabel, and thanks to her I have been promoted. A new role and more pay, it's everything I wanted. You deserve it, Noah. They're lucky you agreed to the move, and it's going to be a wonderful life for us down there. Down where? Eve asked sharply. She looked at her pa, and he flushed, looking slightly awkward. Your father's new job is in New York, at the new offices of Bay Shipping, Suzanne said airily. It's a great opportunity for him to really make a name for himself and get the recognition he deserves. Eve shot an alarmed look at Mabel, who was standing open-mouthed at the news. But what about our jobs? Mabel is just getting started with Mrs. Bobbin, and she's doing so well. And Dr. Jackson is starting to let me go out to visit his patients. If we move to New York, we'll have to leave everything behind. Suzanne sighed and rolled her eyes slightly. How many times do I have to say, girls, your father's progress is what matters? She hesitated before adding, Noah and I have decided it's time for you to think seriously about getting married, Eve. You're 20 years old, and you can't expect your father to support you forever. She sniffed disapprovingly and glanced from Eve's birthmark to Mabel's disfigured hand. I'm not even courting, Eve shot back, lifting her chin defensively. You tell them, Noah. Suzanne sounded suddenly weary. The thing is, what Suzanne is trying to say. Noah gulped down more of his port, looking momentarily lost for words. Oh, for goodness sake, Eve, you're being very obtuse, Suzanne snapped. Your father and I will be moving to New York by ourselves, as is befitting for us as a newly married couple. Frankly, I can't be expected to take on another woman's children, especially as you're both as good as grown up." "Where will we live if we don't come with you?" Eve cried. "Mabel and I can't afford the rent if we stay here, and as I said, I'm not walking out with a gentleman who might become a husband." "I've taken matters into my own hands about your marriage prospects, Eve. We can't leave anything to chance and risk spoiling Noah's prospects at Bay Shipping." She gave Eve a thin smile. "I replied to an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times to a certain Mr. Penn, who has a ranch in Oregon. Your father and I have agreed that your best chance of finding a husband is via correspondence. And thankfully, Mr. Penn has also agreed that Mabel can travel out and live with you, which is more than we could have hoped for." Prosody. The blood drained from Eve's face as Suzanne's words sank in. "Pa! Say something! You can't let Suzanne do this. I want to marry a man who loves me, not someone who lives thousands of miles away who I've never even met." She didn't know whether to cry or be angry. "Ma would never have agreed to this. It's as if you don't even care about me and Mabel anymore." Noah had the grace to look slightly shamefaced, but then he shook his head firmly. "Suzanne is just doing what's best, Eve. I've always been worried about your marriage prospects, and this way is the perfect solution. They are short of women out west, and it's all decided. We're leaving for New York at the end of next month, and that's when you and Mabel can travel to Oregon." But she doesn't even know this man," Mabel cried. "What if he doesn't like us?" "Oh, do stop making such a fuss," Suzanne sighed. "I've portrayed you in a very flattering light in my letters with Mr. Penn, Eve. I mean, I mentioned that you're hardworking and keen to have a family, which is what he asked for. As for," she gestured at Eve's face, "as for your birthmark, once you get there, I'm sure he won't mind. And they always need good dressmakers, apparently, Mabel. So you'll find work in no time, and then Eve will help you find a husband of your own, I'm sure." "You seem to have thought of everything." Eve shot back, not bothering to keep the bitterness from her voice. "That's enough," Noah said sharply. "Be respectful to Suzanne, or you can leave this house today. I've supported you, and now it's time for you to start a new life, just as Suzanne and I are. Mr. Penn has agreed to marry you, Eve, and I've already paid for your railroad tickets. Now, can we please eat our dinner in peace? Your rudeness is giving me indigestion before I've even taken a mouthful." Eve and Mabel hurried back to the kitchen, both too shocked to say another word, and sank onto their chairs, leaving their food untouched. "You won't leave me behind, will you?" Mabel muttered after a few moments. Her eyes brimmed with sudden tears. "I wish Ma was still with us." Eve pulled her sister into a hug, stroking her hair gently as she sobbed into a handkerchief. As Mabel's tears subsided, Eve came to a decision. "Do you know what? We're better off without them. Pa has changed, and Suzanne clearly doesn't want us around." She gave Mabel a determined squeeze. "We'll travel out to Oregon, and I'll make a success of this marriage. But rest assured, Mabel, I promise I'll always look after you. Ma would have wanted us to stick together, so if heading out west is how we can do that, then so be it." Mabel gave her a watery smile, and her expression brightened as she remembered something. One of Mrs. Bobbin's nieces went to Montana as a mail-order bride. Mrs. Bobbin said she's happily married and living on a beautiful ranch with her first baby now. She blew her nose and grinned. "Maybe it's just the adventure we need, Eve? There's nothing for us here anymore, not now that Ma has gone and Pa is so smitten with his horrible new wife." Chapter 9. Clearsprings, Oregon. Eve nervously fingered the letter in her lap. The edges were worn because she had read it so many times, and as Mabel's head lolled forward and she drifted back off to sleep, lulled by the rocking of the train, she unfolded it to read again. "Dear Eve, I can't tell you how delighted I am that you are finally coming out west with your sister. I know this has been an unconventional courtship, but my ma assures me it's perfectly normal these days. The other men I've spoken with who have done the same get wed as soon as their lady friend arrives. But my ma suggested it might be nice for you to have a few weeks getting accustomed to life on the ranch. I expect it's very different from your busy hometown, and I don't want to rush you. although my intentions to marry you are honorable, of course. Ma has made up a room for you and your sister, which I hope you'll find comfortable. She's very excited about helping you plan the wedding, so I figure we can book the pastor as soon as we agree it's time. I'll meet you off the train. Wishing you both a pleasant journey, Jake Penn. Coming out to meet a man, huh? The woman sitting opposite Eve raised her eyebrows, staring pointedly at the letter. I got me one of those as well, she added, pulling a piece of paper out of her pocket. Yes, I've been corresponding with a rancher. It's all happened very quickly, but my sister and I are looking forward to our new life. Eve turned to gaze out of the window at the vast landscape that stretched away as far as she could see, feeling a sudden sense of overwhelm. After almost a week of traveling, it felt like they had been cut adrift from everything that was familiar. The woman pursed her lips. I got fed up of being treated bad by the man who wanted to marry me back east. I bet he's still fuming. I left him a note, telling him I could do better for myself, and just up and left. She gave Eve a sudden grin, chuckling at her own audacity. That'll teach him to take me for granted. Got me a handsome man out at the gold mines instead. Have you been writing to him for long? Eve was suddenly curious, wondering how many other young women made this journey. Nope. I didn't want to hang around back east and get a beating for my troubles. I answered the advertisement and booked my ticket on the train within weeks. I reckon it's got to be better than being out on the streets. I can make a man happy if you get my meaning. As long as my new man don't beat me, I'm doing well out of it. A new home, someone to look after me. Eve felt herself blushing. She hadn't even thought about the expectations that Jake might have from her as a wife, and she wondered what it would be like to fall in love. The way he described himself in his letters had made him sound rugged and strong, and she had read enough penny novels to know that love would feel warm and wonderful. At least that was what she hoped. She put her hand to her cheek without thinking. Suzanne had insisted that she mustn't mention her birthmark in her letters, even going so far as to read them through before she posted them to make sure Eve had portrayed herself in the best possible light. We don't want to put the poor man off before he's even met you, she had said firmly. He's from a good, God-fearing family by the sound of things, so I'm sure he won't mind the way you look. But in my experience, it's best not to give a man an excuse to back out of an arrangement. Eve felt a ripple of unease as she thought back to Suzanne's words. She had wanted to tell Jake about her birthmark, feeling deceitful for not mentioning it. She realized with a start that she could see Clearsprings in the distance and felt panic rising in her chest. What if he doesn't like the way I look? Without realizing it, Eve had spoken the words out loud, and the woman opposite gave her a reassuring wink. With a beautiful figure like yours? Trust me, he ain't going to be worried about that itty-bitty mark on your face if that's what you're thinking. Besides, I've seen the way you are with your sister. You're kind and thoughtful. He'll be a lucky man to call you his bride. Eve blushed again. It was so long since anyone had paid her a compliment, she hardly knew what to say. Thank you. She felt her spirits lift, suddenly feeling excited at the prospect of falling in love with a rugged rancher. In the bustle of the train stopping and everyone gathering up their luggage to disembark, Eve and Mabel forgot their nerves. The station was nothing grand, just a long platform next to a cluster of low wooden buildings for storing goods and the railroad office. But beyond the station, Eve had been pleased to see that Clearsprings looked like a thriving town nestled within the rolling foothills of a mountain range. The land looked green and fertile, dotted with log cabins beyond the town's perimeter, and in the distance, she could see a lake shimmering under the summer sun. "This looks lovely," Mabel said happily, swinging the carpet bag that held her few clothes and treasured possessions. It felt good to be out of the stuffy atmosphere of the carriage, and the air was pure and clean as she breathed in a deep lungful of it. "Do you have somewhere to go, ma'am?" The station master paused next to them, with a handcart piled up with luggage. "My sister has a boarding house in town if you need somewhere to stay." Eve shook her head with a smile. "Thank you for your kindness, but no, we're being met from the train by Mr. Penn. Do you know if he's here? Jake or Gabriel?" I'm assuming it's not their pa, Frank. Eve blinked. She hadn't realized there were 3 men in the Penn family. Jake? It's Jake who's meeting us. She tucked her letter back in her reticule, hoping he wouldn't think her overly forward asking for a man who she didn't even know what he looked like. I just saw him tying up his horse and wagon out front. The station master seemed unperturbed by her confusion. Jerking his head toward the gateway next to his office, Eve realized that unaccompanied women like her turning up to meet men for the first time was probably a weekly occurrence, judging by how many advertisements she had seen when she had peeked into Suzanne's copy of the Matrimonial Times she had left lying around. As Eve started walking toward the end of the station and the crowds thinned, she suddenly saw a tall, broad-shouldered man hurrying in, clearly looking for someone. He had tousled brown hair and the weathered face of a man who spent most of his time outside, and as he caught sight of the station master, he lifted his hat. "Have you seen 2 young ladies, Brent? I'm meeting them off the train." "Yup, they're waiting for you over there." Brent nodded in Eve's direction, and she felt her mouth go dry with nerves. Jake strode up and then slowed as he got closer, suddenly looking bashful. "Miss Wallace? Eve, I'm Jake Penn, and this must be your sister, Mabel." He took Eve's hand and shook it energetically. "I'm sorry I'm a few minutes late. I didn't mean to keep you waiting. Gabe wanted me to drop him off at the far end of town. Anyway, welcome to Clearsprings." He gestured expansively, sweeping his arms to take in the whole town. "Thank you. And we only just arrived, so it was perfect timing." Eve smiled up at him, watching his expression as her face came into full view, hoping against hope that she wouldn't see him flinch or look away. "That's too kind of you," he chuckled. "I'm the quick one in the family, always in a rush, and Gabe is more methodical, likes to take his time with things. Did I mention in my letters that I have a brother?" He scratched his head and chuckled again. "Letter writing ain't my strong suit. I might have forgotten to tell you about him. He lives at the ranch with us but works in town. There are probably lots of other things I should tell you as well. But, well, I figure we have plenty of time to fill in all the details as we get to know each other, huh?" Eve and Mabel fell into step next to Jake as he took their bags off them and left the station. The wagon was hitched on the edge of a long, dusty street. Glancing in each direction, Eve could see a mercantile store, a bank, several saloons, as well as numerous hotels, guest houses, and the usual businesses needed by a growing population. "The place looks busy," Eve commented. "Hopefully, Mabel will be able to find work easily enough. We want to contribute our bit," she added. "Ma's already put the word out. Don't you worry about that." Jake stacked their bags next to a pile of fencing posts and lumber in the back of the wagon and helped them both up onto the seat before unhitching the horse. "Get up, Floss." He clicked his tongue, and the sturdy horse clopped forward, eager to get home. As the wagon trundled through the town, Eve felt glad that she had Mabel by her side, keeping up a running commentary about how much she liked the town and how the countryside was so colorful compared to Baltimore. Eve felt unusually tongue-tied, and she wasn't sure why. Whenever she had spoken with Dr. Jackson's patients, he had commended her on how easy she found it to chat and put people at their ease. But now that she was sitting next to Jake's solid presence, everything she had planned to talk about had deserted her. "It's kind of strange meeting like this, don't you think?" Jake gave her an amused look as though reading her mind. "Usually Ma says I can talk the hind leg off a donkey, but," he shrugged, "if there's anything you want to know about the ranch, that I can talk about all day long." He raised his hand and pointed toward the lake. "Our land runs up to the edge of Clearsprings Lake and the river that feeds it. We're lucky. It means we've always got water for the cattle." Eve felt her nerves ebbing away. "It's certainly much more beautiful than I imagined it would be. My stepmother said there are gold mines nearby, and somehow I imagined it would be barren and dusty here. There are places like that out on the plains, for sure. But with the snow off the mountains feeding the rivers and lakes here, this is perfect land for raising cattle." A hint of pride tinged Jake's tone as they left the edge of town, and a few minutes later a carved wooden sign came into view. "This is us. Are you ready to meet Ma and Pa?" Eve nodded. "Sunnybrook Ranch. That has a nice sound to it." Brought to life by my parents' grit and determination, Jake said. They came here as newlyweds when the land was just wide open pasture and the town nothing more than one street. The wagon rumbled along the rutted track, and Eve could see a sturdy log cabin ahead with a long veranda wrapped around it. Smoke drifted up from the chimney, and there was a row of washing flapping in the breeze on a line strung between the trees in the orchard. As they pulled up out front, Jake turned to look at Eve. I'm really glad you came. Maz being saying it's time for me to settle down, and I never imagined you'd be so pretty from your letters. You don't mind? You don't mind about the birthmark on my cheek? Eve looked him in the eye, holding her breath as she waited for his reply. She knew that if she didn't mention it now, she would be eaten up with wondering whether he found her looks disappointing. Of course not, Jake replied quickly, shaking his head. I'm just a simple rancher. It matters more to me that you can fit into our ways. Ranching life ain't for everyone. His thoughts drifted back to the way Vanessa had left. He had often wondered whether she had found the idea of living at the ranch dull. But then he quickly pushed the thought from his mind, focusing on Eve again. Come and meet Ma and Pa. Gabe will be back home later, so let's get you both settled in. Chapter 10. This is charming, Mrs. Penn. Thank you so much. Eve's heart was full of gratitude as she surveyed their room. The sun slanted through the window onto the colorful rag rug on the wooden floor, and the two narrow beds each had a faded patchwork quilt on them. Call me Anne, dear. Now then, Mabel, I've put a little chest of drawers next to your bed where you can keep all your treasures. I expect you'll have a few things of your own that you'd like to put out to make it feel more homey. Mabel nodded shyly. I would like to put Ma's sewing box on top if that's okay. It's a nice way to remember her by. She swallowed the lump in her throat as she suddenly felt homesickness sweep over her, and Eve gave her arm a sympathetic squeeze. Our Ma only died a few months ago, and Pa remarried, Eve explained. We were very close to Ma, and Mabel has inherited her love of sewing. I understand, dear, Anne said. She gave Mabel a warm smile. You must never feel that you can't talk about your family or your old life here. I know things will likely feel a bit strange to start with, but folks are friendly in town, and you'll settle in no time. Now, why don't you both freshen up, and then you can help me fix something for dinner while Jake and Eve get acquainted. She gestured to the pitcher of water on the washstand where there was a posy of flowers in a jug and clean towels. You've made us feel so welcome already, Anne. Thank you. Eve took her bonnet off and hung it up on the back of the door. I'm just happy to have 2 more women about the place, Anne replied with a wry smile. As much as I love my menfolk, sometimes I long for a bit of female company. I'll leave you to unpack while I go and dig up some vegetables from the garden. As Anne left the room, Eve gave Mabel a hug. I think we're going to be very happy here, don't you? Ma would have been pleased. I know it's a big change from everything we've left behind, but it's a relief just to be away from Suzanne and her constant criticism. They seem very welcoming, Mabel agreed. She pulled her wooden sewing box out of her bag and gave it pride of place on the dresser, next to her brush and hair ribbons, stroking the raised carving on the box's lid. At that exact moment, the drapes rippled in the breeze, and a sunbeam cast its soft light on the sewing box. See, it's as if Ma's giving us her blessing, Mabel. Eve poured water into the bowl and swirled a flannel in it before bending over to wash her face. Peering in the mirror, she could see that her cheeks already had a healthy glow from the wagon ride, and she dabbed some lavender water on her wrists and neck to get rid of the smell of the steam train, which lingered on her before changing into a plain calico dress. A couple of hours later, Mabel was happily chopping up onions and potatoes to make a stew with Anne as Eve folded the laundry, which had dried on the line. Shall I take you for a look around outside? Jake loomed in the doorway and took his hat off. Can you spare Eve, Ma? Of course, son. Why don't you show Eve all the animals? You aren't afraid of cattle, I hope? Anne questioned. Well, I've never really been up close to them, Eve confessed, but I'm always happy to learn. Anne nodded. That's good. It's important that everyone can pitch in and help on a ranch. Frank used to do all the cattle work himself, but I used to help round them up. We'll give you Floss to ride. She knows exactly what to do. All you have to do is let her get on with it. Jake noticed Eve's worried frown. Ma didn't mean to go riding right now, he said hastily. There's a nice walk through the pastures down to the river we can do. You'll be able to see right across our land, and I expect you'll want to stretch your legs after traveling all week. Just let me get my bonnet. Eve tied the ribbons under her chin and fell into step next to Jake as he strolled off. Did your ma mean what she said about Floss? I've never needed to ride a horse before. Everything was local to us in Baltimore, so I just used to walk everywhere. Jake grinned. Floss will take good care of you. Don't you worry. She's like a big, comfortable armchair. Everyone learns to ride out here practically before you can walk. You'll soon pick it up. He pointed toward the mountains. That's Trout Creek Ridge. We get snow on the mountains in the winter, and you have to be careful of bears if we ride up there. Bears? I hadn't thought about that. I'm afraid so. And cougars. They don't tend to come down to the ranch, don't worry. Unless they're short of food if it gets very cold, then they can come hunting. But we get the cattle into the pens and keep watch. Eve shielded her eyes from the sun as it started to sink low in the sky. Ahead of them, the meadows rippled in the breeze, and the cattle grazed contentedly, working their way slowly from one tasty clump of grass to the next, swishing their tails against the flies. She felt a sense of peace wash over her and smiled up at Jake. Your ma told me she's happy we're here. She's made us feel very welcome. Uh-huh, that's Ma. She won't say so directly, but she was disappointed Gabe and I hadn't settled down and gotten married yet. His words trailed off awkwardly. I guess you might be wondering why? Eve shook her head with a small shrug. My stepmother told me it was because there aren't many women out here on the western frontier. You're right. There are more men than women out here. What with the miners and men traveling out to settle on a parcel of land. Gabe was going to marry, but Lucy died from influenza. And I just never met the right woman, Jake added. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing that what he had said wasn't strictly true. He had thought Vanessa was very much the right woman, but she had had other ideas. I'm sorry to hear about Gabe's loss, Eve said quietly. He'll get over it one day, Jake replied. In fact, I've been trying to persuade him to start courting again, but he always says he's too busy with his work. Speaking of being busy, I've spoken with the pastor, and he suggested we could get married in about 8 weeks if that suits you. There's always a lot to do on the ranch with all the summer jobs at this time of year. We have to make the most of the good weather. He took Eve's hand in his own and turned to face her. I'm not much given to romantic gestures, Eve, but I think we can make a good life together. And I do too, Eve agreed. She looked into his brown eyes and took in the firm set of his jaw, wondering when the sudden surge of emotion she had expected to feel might hit her. Give it time. We've only just met. The thought trickled through her mind, reassuring her. Jake was a good-looking man, in a rugged sort of way. There was no doubting that. But Eve had expected to feel a spark of something between them right away, which she realized now was unrealistic. Let's walk to the river, Jake said cheerily. He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and led her along the track, naming the wildflowers and birds as they went. The rest of the walk passed pleasantly, and Eve was astonished at how huge the landscape felt. She had been used to being hemmed in by buildings, with a constant backdrop of the noise of carriages rumbling through the streets and costermongers shouting across each other, trying to sell their wares. But the ranch felt peaceful by comparison. Even as they had rumbled through Clearsprings town, although it had been busy, it had felt more like the sort of friendly community where folks would stop and say hello, instead of hurrying past, as though you were anonymous. By the time they returned to the cabin, Eve had decided she was glad Suzanne had replied to Jake's advertisement. The only thing she was regretting was leaving her job at Dr. Jackson's. Mabel has made herself right at home, Anne said happily when they got back. She's laid the table and helped me no end. I'm not as nimble as I used to be, and Mabel has been up the ladder and picked a bucket of apples. Ma makes the best apple pie, Jake said with a grin. Although I guess I'd better not say that after we're married. Eve felt her cheeks go pink at the reference to their wedding. but before she could reply, Anne clasped her hands together with a dreamy expression. "Have you agreed on a date yet, Jake? We don't want to leave it too long, but I know you'll want a bit of time to get to know one another. I know Elizabeth will ask me when I next go into town." "That's the woman who runs the matrimonial agency," Jake explained. "Tell her not to panic, Ma," he added with a roll of his eyes. "Eve and I have agreed to leave it a few weeks until after I've made the hay. You'll soon find that folks out here like to know everyone's business, Eve." "I'll introduce you to all my friends," Anne continued. "They can't wait to meet you, and we'll invite some of them back to the ranch to celebrate your marriage, of course. Pastor Keller is a fine man. You'll like him." "Don't overwhelm the poor woman," Frank said, giving his wife an amused look. A man of few words, he had been quietly rubbed dubbin into the leather bridle he had laid out on the table. "She's been like the cat who got the cream ever since we knew you were coming out west. Next thing, she'll be knitting baby clothes," he muttered. He shook his head, but Eve knew his words were meant kindly. "Pa, you're no better than Ma, talking about babies already. Poor Eve has only just arrived. I'm going out to check the fences again before it gets dark." Jake gave his parents a good-natured smile before putting his hat back on. "I won't be long," he said, giving Eve a nod and striding off. "Apparently there are cattle rustlers working over the ridge," Frank explained. "There's always something we're up against, but when it's thieves, curse them. It makes my blood boil." "Don't overexcite yourself, dear." Anne put a calming hand on his shoulder. "They're not likely to come stealing our cattle, being that we're so close to town, and the sheriff said his posse are doing more patrols." Frank harumphed, and Eve felt a shiver of alarm. "It ain't right, Anne. A man works hard all his life to build something out of the nothin' for his family, and then those crooks think they can steal it all away. The only good thing for them is jail or to be strung up." "We had cattle stolen when we first came here," Anne said, her eyes clouding at the memory. "Frank's never forgotten it. Luckily, they didn't get far, and the sheriff managed to get the cattle back. But you can't be too careful. Jake will teach you how to shoot the rifle, just in case." Before Eve could reply, the sound of a horse approaching made Anne look up from the range where she was stirring the stew. "That'll be Gabe, home from work. He's the apothecary in Clearsprings," she added with a gleam of pride in her eyes. "Really? Jake didn't mention that's what he does," Eve said. She felt a sudden surge of happiness that she would have someone to talk to about her work at Dr. Jackson's. "Would you take this bucket of scraps out for the piglets, dear? Did Jake show you where they were?" Eve nodded and took the bucket from Anne, glad to be able to help. As she walked toward the barn, she wondered whether Gabriel might want an assistant, but then dismissed the idea immediately. Jake had made it pretty clear that her place would be on the ranch, and she knew it would be unusual for a married woman to work away from the home. She felt a pang of regret that everything she had learned from the doctor would go to waste. "Can I help you with that?" Eve jumped at the deep voice as a figure emerged from the shadow of the barn. "Sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to scare you." Gabriel stepped closer into the evening sun, and Eve found herself looking up into a pair of warm hazel eyes with an apologetic expression. "I'm Gabriel," he added, taking the bucket from her. "You must be Eve? I see Ma has gotten you busy already." Eve smiled. "I'm glad of it," she said quickly. "I don't like to be idle." Gabriel tipped the scraps over the fence, and 3 piglets ran over, rooting through them with obvious enjoyment. "They always make me smile," he said, watching the animals. "This is my favorite time of the day," he added, gesturing towards the western horizon. The sun looked huge as it sank, lighting up the sky with a dramatic wash of pinks and oranges, and Eve gasped at how beautiful it looked. "I can see why. You're very fortunate to have grown up somewhere so wonderful. It's the perfect place to raise a family." Eve suddenly remembered Jake's words about Gabriel's shattered dreams of marrying and having his own family and wished she could take her words back. A shadow of regret passed across Gabriel's face, but it was quickly gone, and Eve vowed to herself that she would be more thoughtful not to remind him of losing his fiancée in the future. "Jake and I certainly had an idyllic upbringing," Gabriel said as they strolled toward the cabin. "It was hard work, mind you." But the Lord blessed us when Pa found this plot of land to settle and create the ranch. A sudden gust of wind whipped Eve's shawl off her shoulders, and it floated away, landing in the grass just beyond Gabriel. He quickly bent down and handed it back to her. As she took it off him, their fingers brushed, and Eve felt a shiver of emotion ripple through her that she didn't recognize. Thank you, she stuttered. The wind can get up when you least expect it, Gabriel replied. His gaze lingered on her face, but his expression was hard to read in the failing light. Don't get cold, he said quietly. Let's get inside, otherwise Ma might worry that I'm boring you with talk of my work. He smiled, and Eve's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way his hazel eyes hinted at hidden depths and a calmness about his demeanor that she found intriguing. Oh no, I'd love to know all about your work. I wouldn't find it the slightest bit boring. Eve said earnestly. She felt her breath catch with confusion as she saw Jake galloping back toward them through the meadow grass and noticed that Gabriel was watching her as she looked towards Jake. Well, if you'd like to tell me, she added. Maybe sometime in the future, Gabriel replied with a good-natured smile. I'm sure you'll want to spend time with Jake, getting to know about his work more than mine. Yes, of course. Eve followed him into the cabin and couldn't help thinking that she would rather spend the evening hearing about Gabriel's apothecary work, telling herself that it was purely because it was what she was familiar with from her time with Dr. Jackson. Chapter 11. The next few weeks flew by as Eve and Mabel settled into their new life, and Eve became accustomed to the rhythms of being on a ranch. She soon learned that the animals came first. Whether it was the middle of the night or the crack of dawn, if one of the animals needed attention, Jake would tug his boots on and hurry away with cheerful dedication, and Anne would stoke up the range in case he needed hot water to treat an animal or coffee to stave off tiredness. After looking deep into her conscience about the unexpected way she had felt drawn to Gabriel on her first night at Sunnybrook, Eve had been careful to devote all her attention to Jake, although it had been hard for them to spend much time together, what with him being so busy outside. Why don't I pack you up a picnic and you can go out to the fields to eat with Jake tonight? Anne bustled around the kitchen, clattering plates as Eve kneaded dough to bake bread. Mabel sat near the door, which had been propped open to catch any breeze, and was working her way through a pile of mending. The air felt heavy after a spell of humid weather, and Anne fanned herself. Reckon we could do with a good shower of rain to cool the air, but not until Jake's finished making the hay. Would that be okay? I don't want to disturb him if he's too busy to stop his work. Eve pushed a lock of hair back from her forehead as she divided the dough and shaped it into several loaves. Anne gave her a shrewd look. One thing you gotta learn, Eve, is that you have to seize the chance to spend a little time together. Frank would labor morning, noon, and night when he was younger. The jobs are never finished. It ain't like city folk who can go courting at the park or take a visit to the theater. When you work on the land, it's about snatching a few moments together when you can. Thank you. In that case, I would very much like to take a picnic out. Eve gave the older woman a hesitant smile. I'm not experienced in romance, as you can probably tell. I always imagined that Ma would help guide me when it came to marriage, but that wasn't to be. She paused for a moment before continuing. I was a little worried that I might not live up to Jake's expectations because of the way I look. She blurted out, Honey, you can put that thought straight out of your head. Anne poured 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to Eve with a reassuring smile. The good Lord tells us not to judge others by their looks. It's what's in your heart that matters, and I can tell that Jake is very fond of you. She took a sip of her drink and chuckled. He might not be one for romantic gestures, but that's just his way. Well, both of my boys are like that. Gabe took losing Lucy hard, but I hope he finds love again one day. I'm praying that he'll see how happy you make Jake and that I can persuade him to place his own advertisement with Elizabeth for a bride, too. Eve was surprised to feel a pang of something that she couldn't define as Anne chattered on about her hopes for Gabriel. She tried to imagine him with a beautiful woman on his arm who was filled with admiration for his apothecary skills, and for a split second, it gave her a wistful yearning that it could have been her. She blinked hastily, trying to erase the image from her mind. "I'm sure if anyone can persuade Gabe to open his heart again, it would be Jake," she replied quickly, hoping that her confusing emotions weren't showing on her face. "I can tell they're very close. Jake always speaks very highly of his brother." "They've always looked out for each other," Anne agreed. Her expression softened as she thought about her sons. "You've probably seen that Gabe isn't as strong as Jake. The doctor said it had something to do with his muscles and that there wasn't a thing we could do about it. I prayed every night because Frank wanted 2 strapping boys to take over the ranch one day. But the Lord blessed Gabe with a quick mind instead. He used to read books every evening after doing his chores in the hope of becoming a doctor. But we couldn't spare him to take the time away to study, so he became an apothecary instead. That sounds a lot like Eve. She was forever poring over her medical books." Mabel snipped the piece of cotton and threaded her needle to mend the next shirt in her pile. Eve felt her cheeks turning pink as Anne gave her a surprised look. "It was just the books Dr. Jackson gave me. I used to enjoy learning about diseases and treatments, only so I wouldn't show myself up in front of his patients," she added. Anne nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you have a lot in common with Gabe in that case." Before she could continue, a shout from Frank, who was outside, interrupted them. "I promised I would take him for a ride out in the wagon. He likes to see what Jake's been up to, even if he can't help out any longer. I'll be sure to have Floss back as soon as possible so you can ride her later." With that, she took her apron off and picked up her bonnet. "Remind me to talk to you about work later, Mabel. I think one of my friends might be able to help you get started with some dressmaking. You're too good to let that skill go to waste." Chapter 12. Hold her still, will you? Eve stepped up onto the bottom rung of the fence as Jake had taught her and clambered into the saddle while Mabel held Floss's bridle, although the horse just stood there patiently, knowing not to move until Eve was properly settled. The sun was low in the sky as Mabel waved them off, and Eve enjoyed the light wind, which lifted the hair from her neck, cooling her. Floss's broad back rolled comfortingly beneath her, and Eve rested her hands lightly on the reins. The horse seemed to know exactly where they were heading, and before long, her ears flicked forward as she whinnied to Blade, where Jake had tethered him in the shade of a tree near the river. "This is a nice surprise." Jake wiped the sweat from his brow and put down the scythe, grinning up at her. "I was all but finished for the day." The swathes of grass that Jake had spent the day cutting were already drying out, and a delicious scent of meadow hay filled the air, as heady as any perfume Eve had ever smelt. "It's heavenly, ain't it?" He helped Eve down from the horse, slipping the bridle off Floss so she could graze. "I've never seen anything like it." Eve watched as butterflies danced over the meadow flowers on the edge of the field, and birds swooped low over the river, looking for midges to feed on. "I don't think I'd ever want to leave. Not now. I've seen what it's like in the country." Jake picked up his rake and started gathering the driest grass into windrows, ready to load onto the wagon the following day. "I gotta admit, I was worried you might not like it here," he said, sounding breathless from the exertion. "You don't miss working for the doctor, then?" Eve hesitated for a moment before answering, wanting to choose her words with care. "I do miss it a little," she confessed. "But it was as much a sense of being useful for our family than the work itself, and I can see how helping you on the ranch would be useful in its own way." She picked a blade of grass and chewed on the sweet end of it. "I'd hope to be as confident as your ma one day, but it might take me a while to learn." "You're picking it up already," Jake said. The muscles on his arms gleamed with sweat as he swept the rake rhythmically back and forth. "You've learned to ride just fine, and I can already tell that Ma finds it a great help having you and Mabel in the house. She doesn't like to say anything, but I often hear her getting up in the night because her joints are aching so much. It's good that you can take over some of her chores, although she'll never be one to sit and relax." "Are you paying me a compliment about my riding, Jake?" Eve rubbed her shoulders, which still ached from her efforts at learning to ride a horse, and giggled as he blushed. "Well, at least you don't look like you're about to slide off every time Floss breaks into a trot anymore," he joked back. "Shall we eat now?" Eve laid her shawl on the ground and unpacked the food from her saddlebag. There was a slice of cold pie and 2 crisp red apples with some bread and cheese. They sat together companionably as Jake talked about his childhood. Every corner of the ranch held memories, and he had a way of bringing them to life so that Eve could practically see Jake and Gabriel as 2 young boys, splashing in the river and fetching the cattle home in snowdrifts up to their knees. "I'd better get on with my work again." Jake yawned wearily and helped Eve up, holding her hand for longer than was strictly necessary. "I enjoyed this," he murmured. Eve wondered for a moment whether he was going to kiss her, but there was a hesitation in his eyes as if something was stopping him. "Tell Ma I'll be late back. I want to get as much grass cut as I can in case the weather turns." He waved goodbye before walking off with his rake, leaving Eve to pack up the saddlebag again. Watching his retreating back, Eve felt a pang of disappointment. Part of her wanted Jake to sweep her into his arms and kiss her so she could experience the thunderbolt of passion she had heard so many girls talk of when they were in love. But she respected that he didn't want to behave improperly. "Since when did you get so fanciful about romance?" she muttered to herself under her breath, shaking her head at her own silly daydreams. "Jake and I aren't like that. Not yet, anyway." She sighed and gazed up at the shimmering leaves of the maple tree above them, pushing away the worries that still niggled at the back of her mind. Is this what love really feels like? The thought slid into her mind, and she felt a sharp pang of loss that she couldn't ask her ma. She knew from Anne and Frank's occasional comments that Jake had been courting someone before, but Anne had assured her that it had come to nothing. Even so, Eve couldn't help but wonder whether Jake was really ready to spend the rest of his life with her. Just as she was about to leave, she noticed a heart and some letters carved into the bark of the tree. She stepped closer and traced her fingers over the initials, J and V. Jake and? She wondered who the letter V belonged to, and whether Jake had really gotten over the woman who had meant so much to him that he had inscribed it forever into this mighty tree. Clambering back onto Floss, Eve did her best to put her doubts to one side. Jake had proposed, and there was no reason why they couldn't have a happy marriage where love could blossom over time, she told herself. The steady clopping of Floss's hooves soon cheered Eve up, and her spirits lifted as she saw the log cabin come back into view. She wondered what Anne had in mind for Mabel's work, and knew that her sister was excited to resume her dressmaking. Suddenly, Eve's daydreams were interrupted by Floss's sharp whinny of fear. She felt the horse bunch powerfully under her and gasped with horror as a snake slithered out of the grass, almost beneath Floss's hooves. "Steady, girl. It's all right." Eve grabbed hold of Floss's mane as the horse pranced and kicked out at the snake before breaking into a juddering gallop. "Stop! Floss, stop!" Eve threw herself low over the horse's neck, clinging on for dear life, and closed her eyes as the ground rushed past, convinced it could only end in certain death. "Whoa there, Floss, easy girl." Gabriel's deep voice rang out, and Eve felt the horse skid to a halt, her ribs heaving beneath her legs. "Eve, are you all right?" Without daring to open her eyes, Eve felt strong hands around her waist, and she slid off the saddle into Gabriel's arms. I thought. She tried to speak, but it was as if she had lost all her senses, and she just opened her eyes and waited for the trembling in her legs to subside. "I know. You don't have to try and say anything. I understand." Gabriel held her and spoke in a crooning voice to Floss. The horse snickered and nudged her soft, velvety muzzle against Eve's hand. "I think she's trying to tell you she's sorry," he murmured, holding Eve at arm's length to make sure she was all right. "Was it a snake?" Eve nodded and blinked back her tears. "I'm sorry," she gulped. "Anne warned me about them and said that Floss would look after me. I just panicked is all. I've never galloped before." "I remember being terrified the first time I was on a horse that bolted," Gabriel said with a kind smile. "You've done it now, though, and if you don't mind me saying, you're a natural horsewoman." Most people would have fallen off within seconds. You and Floss are clearly a good match. Eve felt her fear draining away and gave him a watery smile. "Thank you for saving my dignity," she chuckled. "I thought either I would fall off or end up being thrown over the first fence we arrived at. I'm very glad you didn't come to any harm. I don't think I could have borne that," Gabriel murmured, glancing away as though speaking to himself. He cleared his throat and stepped back, suddenly realizing that he still had his arms around Eve. "What I meant to say was that Jake would have been upset to see you hurt," he said hastily. "Do you reckon you're up to riding back with me now? It's best to get straight back on again before you lose your nerve, and I'll be right next to you." Eve brushed the dust from her skirts and squared her shoulders. "Just try stopping me," she said firmly. "I'm not going to let a little mishap like that put me off, and you can tell me all about your day to help take my mind off it." A few moments later, as they rode sedately up the track, side by side in the sunset, Eve was hit with the sudden realization that as terrified as she had been by Floss bolting, a part of her had wished that Gabriel's embrace had lasted longer and that it hadn't just been out of brotherly concern. She shivered as the emotions coursed through her, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake marrying Jake, when clearly her heart had feelings for his quiet, unassuming brother Gabriel instead. Chapter 13. I just have to buy some fabric for Mabel and a few supplies from the mercantile store for your ma. Eve waved Jake goodbye as he drove the wagon away. It was only a couple of weeks before they had booked Pastor Keller to conduct their modest wedding, and they had come into town together. When Anne had asked Jake what he was going in for, he had blushed and muttered that it was a surprise, and Anne had given Eve a small wink, whispering later that it must be a gift for his bride-to-be. Jake's thoughts turned to the upcoming wedding as the wagon rumbled along the street toward Gabriel's apothecary. If he hadn't known better, he could have sworn that Gabriel was avoiding him. He hitched Floss to a post, and the door tinkled, announcing his presence. "Howdy, I'll be with you in a moment." Gabriel's voice drifted through from the storeroom. Seeing that there were no customers, Jake headed out back to find him. "It's only me. I just called in to make sure everything's all right. You've hardly been home for the last couple of weeks. Is it something I've done?" Jake's tone was light, but he searched Gabe's face for clues. The two brothers rarely fell out, and it wasn't like Gabe to stay away from the ranch for so long. "Just busy with work, is all." Gabriel shrugged and walked back out into the front of the store to check they were alone. And Jake followed. "There's been an outbreak of influenza, and I've been seeing more people than usual. I figured it was easier to stay in town." "As long as that's all it is." There was a small room upstairs above the shop that could serve as living quarters, but he knew Gabe usually preferred to come home at the end of the day to help on the ranch and spend time with the family. Jake picked up a bottle of pills, looking at them absent-mindedly. "I know it must be hard for you. Me getting married to Eve must remind you of Lucy. I don't want it to come between us, though, Gabe. Will you try and come home tonight? Ma's missing you. We all are." Gabriel nodded and took the bottle back from his brother with a grin. "To be honest, I could do with one of Ma's home-cooked meals. There's only so much food from the saloon a man can take." "What have you come into town for?" Jake shrugged nonchalantly. "I thought I'd better buy something nice for Eve, a little wedding gift. However, I don't know what to get her for the life of me. What would a woman like Eve appreciate?" "A book," Gabriel said immediately. "A book?" Jake burst out laughing. "Why on earth would she want a book? I was thinking of some ribbons. That's what women like, ain't it?" He shook his head in amusement, turning to leave. "I'll tell Ma you'll be home tonight, then. Make sure you come, or she'll be disappointed." As Jake strode off down the street, Gabriel watched him through the window with a troubled expression. He couldn't tell his brother that his work was only part of the reason why he hadn't been home much. An image of the way Eve's blue eyes sparkled when she laughed floated into his mind, and he sighed. He wished he could blank her from his thoughts. But the truth was that ever since he had held her in his arms when Floss had bolted, he could scarcely think of anything else. "It's just a couple more weeks, and then she'll be a married woman," he muttered to himself, turning back to the shelves of medicines. He fervently hoped that once Eve was married to Jake, his own unexpected feelings for her would subside. But until then, he knew he had to stay out of her way in case his emotions showed on his face. He shook his head again, feeling guilty. He had truly never expected to feel anything after Lucy had died. But there was something about Eve's gentle nature and the way she cared for her sister that had finally crumbled the protective wall Gabriel had built around himself. But she was marrying his brother. After the way Vanessa had left Jake without so much as a backward glance, he knew his feelings for Eve would have to stay locked tightly in his heart forever. Known only to him and nobody else, he loved his brother too much to do anything to spoil his chance at finding love again. The door suddenly burst open, snapping Gabriel out of his worries. "Gabe, can you come to the railroad station right away?" The young boy who helped unload the luggage pulled his sleeve with urgency. "A lady who just arrived has fainted clean away and bumped her head. There's blood and all. Reckon she needs bandaging up, and the doctor's out on another call." Gabriel grabbed his treatment bag and nodded. "Sure thing, son. Lead the way." Dropping the latch on the door, he jogged toward the station, glad to be of assistance. Jake hurried along the street, deep in thought. Although he had laughed at Gabe when he had suggested a book as a gift for Eve, it had made him realize that he still didn't know Eve very well. He had been so busy with getting the hay in and checking the fences in case the cattle rustlers struck, he hadn't spent as much time getting acquainted with her as he should have done. It was busy in town, and Jake could see that a train had just arrived, with people disembarking and bustling along the street to their various destinations. He paused to look in a store window at an array of handkerchiefs, ribbons, and hair combs, wondering whether Eve would like something from there. As the wind blew along the street, sending eddies of dust up into the air, Jake had a sudden sense of déjà vu. The last time he had purchased something from this store had been for Vanessa. He had known exactly what she would like, and the green hair ribbons he had chosen had delighted her. Yet a week later, she had left. He sighed and jammed his hands in his pockets, suddenly regretting the trip into town and thinking of all the work he could have been getting on with at the ranch instead. He was aware of people passing behind him on the street, but his mind was stuck in the past, and he felt a sudden yearning for everything he had lost. Chapter 14. "I still have them, you know," a woman's voice said quietly behind Jake as he gazed unseeing into the store window, lost in his thoughts. "Vanessa?" Jake twisted around, unable to believe his eyes. His mouth gaped open in disbelief at the sight of the woman he had almost married standing before him. He shook his head, wondering if it was some sort of hallucination that his troubled thoughts had brought to life. But there was nothing imaginary about the curvaceous red-headed woman in the pale green gown looking at him with her amber eyes. "The green ribbons you gave me. I wear them every day," Vanessa said with a hesitant smile. Why? What are you doing back in Clearsprings?" Jake didn't know whether to sweep her into his arms or shout at her with anger. He stared up and down the street, half expecting to see Eve approaching. "Why are you here, and what do you want?" The questions tumbled out of him, and Jake steered her around the corner into a quiet side street. He had to have answers, but he knew if they were seen together, the gossip mongers would soon be spreading rumors like wildfire. Vanessa Hanley looked down at the ground, choosing her words carefully. Her auburn hair glinted in the sun, and as she had said, the green ribbons he had bought her were artfully fashioned as a trim to her dress. "I'm sorry I left, Jake. I never meant to hurt you. I guess I just got cold feet and thought you'd be better off without me. I always worried that I wasn't woman enough to work on the ranch with you. Your ma is such a force of nature, turning her hand to everything." She bit her lip and gave Jake a soft smile. "You never used to tell me that you loved me very often. I thought maybe you hoped for someone better, but I couldn't bear to hear you say that, so I left to protect myself." Jake shook his head vehemently. "You got it all wrong, Vanessa. I loved you so much, and then you broke my heart. It's not that I didn't care for you. I just ain't good with saying it, I suppose. But where have you been this last year? I never thought I'd see you again." "I worked as a governess to a family back east." Vanessa gave him a wry smile. I realized within a month that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life, but it took me this long to swallow my pride and admit it. Not to mention saving up for a ticket for the railroad so I could come home again. I don't know what to say. Jake scratched his head and gazed at her again, as if she were an apparition that might vanish in a puff of smoke any minute. I don't expect your forgiveness, Vanessa replied, suddenly serious again. I expect you've moved on. A handsome man like you? Her words hung between them, and a look of disappointment washed over her as Jake didn't reply. I just needed to come and apologize in person. The way I left was cowardly and hurtful, and that's not the sort of person I am. Not really. Jake nodded. I know, he said softly. That's why it hit me so hard. I knew you weren't a bad person, but I never had the chance to ask you why you left, or even to try and make things right between us, although Lord knows I wanted to. He jumped as he heard the town clock strike the hour. I have to go. Ma's expecting me, and there are cattle rustlers about. I don't like to leave the ranch for too long. I'm staying in town for a few weeks. I've got work at the new boarding house, and then, well, I guess I'll have to move on again now that I've done what I wanted. She touched his arm lightly and looked into his eyes. I'm not here to make trouble, Jake, if you have someone new in your life. It's good to see you. With that, she turned on her heel and walked quickly away, leaving Jake wrestling against the urge to run after her as fast as his legs could carry him. What am I going to do now? The question came from his lips, almost like a guttural groan. I can't turn Eve away. She's done nothing to deserve that. But Vanessa, oh my, Vanessa coming back? How can I bear to see her when I'm promised to another? Are you okay? A man stumbled past him, smelling of stale beer, and peered at him with bloodshot eyes. Talking to yourself on the street. Sounds like you're in trouble and in need of a swig of whiskey. He grinned, trying to drape his arm over Jake's shoulder to drag him into the saloon, but Jake shook him off. I'm in trouble, all right, he muttered, hurrying back to the wagon. As the maelstrom of emotions swept through him, he didn't even notice the commotion at the station, where his brother was helping a woman to the nearest bench where she could catch her breath while he treated the cut on her head. What should I do? Jake muttered over and over again as he battled with his conscience. Just rest here a while, ma'am. It's just a superficial cut which will heal within a few days. Gabriel caught sight of his brother hurrying back through town and felt his stomach lurch with worry. Jake's face was gray, and everything about him looked shaken, as though he was racked with worry. Glancing further up the street, he suddenly realized why. There, standing in the shadows, watching Jake with longing etched in every fiber of her being, was Vanessa. Gabriel did a double take, feeling as though all the breath had been sucked from his lungs. Why was she back? How did Jake feel about her? A torrent of questions pulsed through his mind. This changed everything, and he had a terrible sense of foreboding that Eve might end up very hurt. You're all very quiet tonight? Cat got your tongue? It was early evening, and Anne spooned out fresh vegetables to go with the sliced beef and handed the plates to everyone at the table. I'm just tired, Ma. Gabriel patted her hand. This was worth coming home for, though. I missed your cooking these last few weeks. Anne smiled before giving Jake a curious look. What about you, son? Did the trip to town earlier go well? Oh, I might have to go back in a couple of days. I didn't get what I wanted, and I need to speak to the sheriff. I noticed one of our fences looked like it's been tampered with. Reckon those rustlers might have come to this side of the mountains now, although I'm praying I'm wrong about that. Should we do some sort of lookout, do you think? Gabe took a piece of bread and scraped some butter on it. I can give you a bit more time now. I think we've turned the corner with this influenza outbreak. He had come home with every intention of confronting Jake with what he had seen earlier, but when he saw the haunted look in his brother's eyes, he realized this was something Jake needed to sort out in his heart first, without him interfering. But the fact that he had just said he wanted to go back into town again within a few days told him that Jake wanted to see Vanessa again. He wondered whether it would be to tell her to leave or beg her to stay. Why don't you let Eve help you out for a while? Mabel said. It's exactly what she used to do for Dr. Jackson, and you sure do look exhausted. Mabel, don't be rude. Eve nudged her sister and shot Gabriel an apologetic look, but he just laughed. I guess it would make sense, Jake said quickly. You know it's not good for you to overwork, Gabe, and I'm sure Ma can spare Eve for a little while, at least until the wedding. What do you think, Eve? You don't have to, but you might enjoy it? Eve nodded slowly, feeling a sense of excitement bubbling up in her chest. I did help Dr. Jackson with influenza patients. He said that if you get on top of the disease quickly with the right treatments, people have a much better chance of getting well again. She gave Gabriel a shy glance, pleased to see him smiling. It would be an enormous help if you don't mind, Jake. I keep saying I should advertise for someone to work with me, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. That's settled then, Anne said happily, pleased that everyone was talking again. She poured some water out and took a sip. Elizabeth called earlier. She said there were lots of people arriving off the train today. Maybe one of them might be looking for a husband, Gabe. She gave her son a fond look and smiled. I told her you would give it some consideration. You can't bury yourself in work forever, you know. Frank chuckled and passed the bread around the table. Next, you'll be looking for a husband for Mabel, dear. He grinned at Anne as Mabel rolled her eyes. Not yet. I've got my new job as a dressmaker to enjoy first. I'm starting next week, and I can't wait to see my gowns on all the fine ladies of Clearsprings. Chapter 15. Eve took a deep breath, taking in the familiar smells, and turned to Gabe with a wide smile. I can't tell you how much I've missed this. She gestured at the shelves, neatly lined with brown bottles of pills and tall glass vessels holding colorful tinctures and tonics to deal with every ailment that the residents of Clearsprings might be troubled with. Gabe chuckled. I never thought I'd hear a young woman say that. He handed her a long apron, which she quickly tied over her dress. Mabel came from Mrs. Fenton's yesterday to give me this for you. She said it was so as you'd look the part. I'm glad she settled into her new job so quickly and that Mrs. Fenton didn't judge her lacking because of her hand. She's had her fair share of troubles, Gabriel replied. Her husband was killed at the gold mine, and her only child suffers from every cough and cold around after being born early. But she's a kind woman who likes to see the best in people. Besides, Ma showed her some of Mabel's sewing, and she was so impressed she didn't want Mabel to work for anyone but her. Eve smiled, but a shadow of worry crossed her face. Mabel had settled so well in their new life that it would be a travesty to make her leave. But over recent days, Jake had become distant, and she found herself wondering yet again whether they were well enough suited to marry. She touched her cheek unconsciously and sighed. Are you sure you don't mind working here? Gabriel was sensitive to Eve's every mood, and he had seen the mixed emotions chasing across her face like clouds scudding across the sun. Eve gave him a hesitant look, as though trying to decide whether to reply. How did you know you loved Lucy, Gabriel? Do you mind me asking? It's just, well, Jake told me you loved her very much indeed, and Ma never had a chance to tell me much about such matters. It's not that I don't love Jake, of course, she added hastily. I just wondered. She busied herself with dusting the bottles, not wanting to see Gabriel's expression in case he was shocked by her question. I guess it's a feeling deep inside, Gabe said slowly. It's knowing that she's the first person I think of when I wake up and the last person I see in my mind when I fall asleep at night. He sighed slightly and shrugged. I'm not the best person to ask, he added with a shake of his head. Eve nodded. The fact that he still spoke in the present tense told her how much he must still miss Lucy. Forget I said anything, she said lightly. Now, what would you like me to do today? Cleaning? Bookkeeping? Nope, that would be a waste of your talents. I propose you come on my rounds with me. I've got the horse and buggy, and we can call on my patients outside of town, and you can help me with all my jobs. How does that sound? Eve's eyes lit up. Really? You're happy for me to come out with you straight away? Oh, Gabriel, thank you. You don't know how much that means to me. You might not say that by the time we've finished, Gabe chuckled. I think the worst of the influenza is over now, but there are plenty more folks who need our help. The rest of the day flew by as they traveled from one ranch to the next, bringing much-needed treatments to those in need. Gabriel was surprised to see how Eve had blossomed so readily in her role. It was as if he was seeing a different woman altogether, someone who was confident yet kind, as though working with the sick was second nature. "Bless you, my dear." Old Mrs. Mackenzie pressed a jar of her best pickles into Eve's hand as she and Gabe got ready to leave their final call of the day. She gave Eve a grateful look, blinking up at her with button-bright eyes in her wizened face. "I'm glad to see that Gabriel has put all that sadness behind him and found himself a fine young woman to make him happy again." "Oh no, it's not what you think," Eve said hastily. She was glad that Gabe was busy with the buggy and hoped he hadn't heard the comment. "Gabriel is to be my brother-in-law, but I'm working with him as he's so busy, and it's what I used to do before I came to Clearsprings." "Are you sure?" Mrs. Mackenzie looked puzzled. "I've known Gabriel ever since he was a young boy, and I can tell you, I ain't ever seen him look so happy, especially since that terrible business with his fiancée getting sick and passing away." She lowered her voice, but her whisper was still loud enough to make Eve wince with embarrassment. "Maybe you've picked the wrong brother, dear. I'm rarely wrong about such things, and I can tell Gabe has a soft spot for you. In fact, I'd go so far as to say he's head over heels in love. Mind you, being a man, he probably doesn't realize it," she added with a chuckle that turned into a wheezing cough. "Remember to stay in by the fire now that the nights are starting to draw in, Mrs. Mackenzie, and take a glass of the tincture if your chest feels sore." If he had heard the old woman's words, which had just shocked Eve into silence, Gabriel gave no indication. "We'd better get going, Eve. I want to make sure we're home before nightfall." Eve nodded and climbed into the buggy next to him as the elderly lady retreated back into her ramshackle cabin and waved them goodbye. Her head swam with what Mrs. Mackenzie had just said. Is it really possible that Gabe might have feelings for me? Is that why Jake has been so distant these last few days? The questions pulsed silently through her mind as the buggy rattled along the road back toward town, leaving Eve feeling more confused than ever. She risked a sidelong glance at Gabriel, wondering what he was thinking, but his expression was impossible to read. Eventually, as they turned off the road and made their way home, Gabriel broke his silence. "I've been meaning to tell you, but wasn't sure how. I might not be able to attend the wedding. Would you be very upset?" His tone was flat, as though he had no choice in the matter. "No, I mean, if that's what you have to do," Eve stuttered. "Have you told Jake?" "Not yet. Ma won't be happy, but it's my work. I have to travel away for work on that day. Something has come up that I forgot to tell you about. In fact, I've been thinking it's time for a fresh start for me. I might look for work elsewhere. There are too many memories here." Eve felt her stomach sink and blinked back sudden tears. The thought of not seeing Gabriel's kind face every day hit her like a punch in the solar plexus. She was glad it was almost dark, and he couldn't see how wretched his news had made her feel. "I see. Well, that's a terrible shame, but you must do what you think is right." Eve scrambled down from the buggy as soon as the cabin came into sight, wondering how she was going to get through the evening when her emotions were in such turmoil. "It's not what I want to do, but I must." Gabriel's whispered words were lost in the darkness as he watched Eve running away, and he trudged across to the barn to feed and water his horse with a heavy heart. Chapter 16. When Eve sat down to eat dinner later that night, Jake seemed troubled. He had dark circles under his eyes as though he hadn't slept for days, and he picked at his food. "Did you get what you needed from town?" Anne gave his barely touched plate a pointed look before clearing it away with a clatter. "It's only a few days until the wedding, and our friends are looking forward to coming back to the ranch for a celebratory meal afterward. I've been busy baking all day." "Yes, I did, Ma." Jake picked at a bread roll, chewing it slowly. He could barely meet Eve's eye, and even Mabel noticed his troubled mood, raising her eyebrows as Eve gave her a small shrug. "There's no point worrying yourself sick about these cattle rustlers, son." Anne patted Jake's hand. "You're doing the best you can." "I think I'll go and keep watch down near the river tonight," Jake replied, looking brighter. "I was thinking that would be the perfect place for them to steal our cattle from." All they would have to do is drive them across the river, and they'd be gone. He stood up abruptly. "I'm going now. Don't wait up for me." With that, he jammed his hat on and hurried into the night, slamming the door behind him. "I don't know what's gotten into him," Frank muttered. "Whatever it is, it's no way to behave right before his wedding. He's just got a lot on his mind," Anne said hastily. She gave Eve a worried look. "Are you feeling all right, dear? You look rather pale." Eve nodded. "I do have a headache coming on. I think I'll go to bed early tonight, as soon as I've finished my chores." A few hours later, as the full moon rose in the sky, Eve tossed and turned in her narrow bed. Mabel's breathing was slow and regular, and she had drifted off to sleep within minutes of snuggling under her patchwork coverlet. But Eve's mind was racing, and sleep eluded her. Coming to a sudden decision, she knew she had to speak with Jake, and it couldn't wait a moment longer. She sat up and slipped into her dress, taking care not to wake Mabel. Tiptoeing out, she tilted her head to make sure everyone was asleep. Other than the occasional creak of the beams, the cabin was silent, and Eve wrapped her shawl over her shoulders before hurrying away to the barn. "I know it isn't the usual time for us to go out, Floss, but you don't mind, do you?" Eve stroked the horse's velvety muzzle, drawing comfort from the gentle creature before slipping the bridle onto her, not bothering with a saddle. The bright moonlight bathed everything in a silvery glow, and moments later, Floss plodded toward the river as she had done thousands of times in her life, carrying Eve to her moment of reckoning. "Jake? It's me." Eve slipped off Floss's broad back and tied her reins to a post. Now that she was here, her mouth felt dry with nerves, and she wondered whether she was about to ruin everything. "I kinda wondered if you would come." Jake walked slowly toward her with a sorrowful expression. "There's something I need to tell you, and I've been trying to figure out the best way to say it." "And I have something I have to say too. It can't wait." Eve's words came out in a rush, and she lifted her chin, suddenly feeling a sense of calm come over her. Whatever happened, she was doing the right thing. She had to tell Jake her feelings, or it wouldn't be fair to any of them. "I'm sorry, Jake, but I can't marry you." Eve reached out and took his hand to soften her words. "You're a wonderful man, and I adore being here at Sunnybrook, but I just don't feel the way a wife should feel about a husband. I kept hoping the spark would come, but—" Jake nodded slowly. "I know, Eve. And I'm sorry it hasn't turned out how I'd hoped. I thought I could force myself to fall in love if I gave it enough time. But the truth is, my heart still lies with Vanessa." He glanced toward the carving on the tree trunk, and as the moonlight hit his face, Eve could see his expression was full of regret and also hope. He sighed deeply before continuing. "I never expected to see her again, but she came back to Clearsprings a couple of weeks ago, Eve. I'm so very sorry. I tried to fight my feelings, but I still love Vanessa, and it wouldn't be fair of me to marry you knowing that." Eve felt as though a huge weight had suddenly lifted from her shoulders, and she smiled at him. "Don't be sad, Jake. It just wasn't meant to be." "But what will you and Mabel do? I went to the bank, and I have enough money to pay for your railroad tickets to go back east." Jake's voice was racked with guilt. "Mabel is so happy with her job, and I know you don't have a family to go back to." Suddenly, he pulled Eve into a brotherly hug before holding her at arm's length and looking deep into her eyes. "I know what I want you to do, but I don't know if I dare say it, or even if it's my place to say it after what I've done." "And what would that be?" Eve shivered with emotion as the moonlight lit up the homestead across the paddocks, feeling her heart pulling her back there. "Gabriel loves you," Jake said gently. "I've known it for weeks, but how could I say anything when you'd come here to be with me? It's all such a mess." "Are you sure? You know him better than anyone," Eve replied. Her heart started thumping in her chest. "How can you be sure he's really over Lucy?" Jake shook his head firmly. "He loved her, but not in the way he is with you, Eve. You have to believe me. He's like a different man when he's with you. I can see it, and I reckon Ma has realized too. You don't ever need to wonder whether you're second best. You and Gabe are meant to be together. I just hope he can put his pride to one side and admit how he feels about you." He paced back and forth before stopping in front of Eve again. "And what about you, Eve? You've said you don't love me? Could you learn to love Gabe instead? Eve smiled as hope fizzed in her veins. That was the other thing I wanted to say. I've had feelings for Gabe for a while, but, like you said, it was all a terrible mess. So I hid them away, thinking he was still grieving for Lucy. You love him too? Jake released a huge sigh of relief. Thank the Lord we came to our senses. He untied Floss, helping Eve get back onto her broad back, and the horse snickered and flicked her ears toward the cabin, knowing it was time to go home. I reckon you and Gabe need to take a walk outside in the moonlight. It's time for some straight talking. He slapped Floss on her rump and grinned as she galloped off, and Eve's long blonde hair flew out behind her. Whoa, girl. Eve slowed Floss to a walk as they approached the barn, and the horse whinnied as Gabriel stepped out from the shadows. Is everything all right? Gabe's voice was full of concern, and he held the bridle as Eve dismounted. I heard you leaving earlier, and I was worried. You looked kinda sad at dinner tonight. Is it because I said I wasn't coming to the wedding? I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings. It's just, I don't think I can. Eve shook her head. I was sad because I can't imagine spending a single day without you, Gabe, and you said you're thinking of leaving. I've been struggling with knowing what to say for weeks, but I had to put it right before the wedding. I just went down to the river to tell Jake I can't marry him. You mean you're leaving Sunnybrook? Gabe's face fell. Jake still loves Vanessa, and I hope they will get married. In fact, I'm sure they will. Eve knew that this was her moment, to be honest, and that if she didn't say anything, she would regret it forever. I couldn't have married him anyway. My heart belongs to someone else, a man who is everything I ever dreamed of. Kind, handsome. Her words petered out as a look of understanding flashed into Gabe's eyes. Will you stay, Eve? I love you so very much, but I had to tell myself we could never be together. Otherwise, it would have driven me crazy. Will you be my wife? I've wanted to ask you for so long, but I couldn't say anything while I still believed Jake had feelings for you. Gabriel stepped forward and gazed deep into Eve's eyes. Her hair looked like spun gold in the bright moonlight. And as she nodded, he swept her into his arms, their lips meeting in a passionate kiss. Are you sure this is what you want? Eve murmured, needing to know without a shadow of a doubt. Are you really over mourning, Lucy? You don't mind about the birthmark on my face? She looked into Gabriel's eyes, wanting to see everything that was in his heart. Oh, Eve, I shut myself away and buried myself in work, telling myself it was better for me to stay single than risk being hurt again. But what sort of life is that? When you came here, it was as if I'd woken up from a long sleep, and everything became joyous again. I had a reason to look forward because you were in my life. But you were already promised to Jake, and I realized I couldn't hide my feelings forever, which is why I told you I couldn't come to the wedding. And now I'm a free woman, Eve said with a chuckle. Free to be with you, Gabe, and to stand by your side and support your work as we build a new life together. I prayed the Lord would show me a way through all of this, and he listened. I think Anne and Frank are going to be surprised to be preparing for 2 weddings instead of 1. Nothing will make Ma happier than hearing that, trust me. Gabe swept Eve into his arms again and kissed her tenderly, cherishing every moment as their hearts beat together under the stars. I think I can hear Jake's horse. Shall we go inside and tell everyone the good news? Eve rested her head against Gabe's broad chest, savoring the feeling of joy that was coursing through her body that she had waited so long for. Overhead, a shooting star sent a streak of silver across the inky sky, and she gave silent thanks for her good fortune. This is the happiest day of my life, she murmured. I love you, Gabe, and I always will. Epilogue. 1 year later. Are you ready, Eve? Hurry up, will you? Mabel poked her head around the door, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Do you want me to help you tighten the stays on your dress? They're not going to start without us, Eve replied with a grin, as she did up the last few buttons and draped a shawl over her shoulders. Mabel's excitement was infectious, and the 2 sisters hurried outside, arm in arm. Your wagon awaits. Gabe lifted his hat, and once the 3 of them were settled on the seat, he clicked his tongue, and Floss pulled against the traces. Ma has taken enough to feed an army. The dust ahead of them showed where Anne and Frank had already made their way across the paddock toward the bend in the river, which was their destination. A few minutes later, the sound of hammering and knocking drifted across in the late summer breeze. "There it is!" Mabel sat up straighter, shading her eyes. "I can't believe so much of it is up already. Jake rounded up all his friends from town, and they've agreed to work until it's finished. Shouldn't take more than a couple of days." Gabriel felt the warmth of Eve next to him through his jacket and thought for the 100th time how blessed he was. Our own cabin. Eve's voice held a note of wonder as she looked at the low wooden frame of the building ahead of them as it came to life. A dozen men swarmed over it, sawing logs, heaving them into place, and using complicated rope pulleys to raise their home from the grassy plateau in the meadow where they would soon be living. The river rippled at the far end of the meadow, and the mountains rose in the distance. At just a few minutes' ride from the main cabin of the ranch, it was the perfect place for them to live, so they would still be close enough to be part of the family. "Do you like it?" Gabe glanced at Eve. "You do realize what day it is, don't you?" She smiled up at him. "1 year to the day since we got married, my love. What a perfect way to celebrate our anniversary." Gabe pulled the wagon to a halt and helped Eve and Mabel down. The back of the wagon was piled high with furniture, rugs, and all the things that would make the cabin a proper home. "Isn't it exciting?" Vanessa hurried toward them. "I'm trying to persuade Jake to stop and have some lemonade, but you know what he's like." She linked arms with her sister-in-law as they strolled around the site. "Are you sure you don't mind that it's me and Jake living in the big house?" "Of course not," Eve said quickly. "With Gabe working in town, it makes sense for you and Jake to live up there. I'm so glad things have worked out so well." Vanessa gave her arm a sudden squeeze. "You and Gabriel are perfect together, you know? It's true what I said when I first met you. You make him happier than he's ever been in his whole life." Eve nodded. Any thoughts that he might have still yearned for Lucy had long gone, and he had welcomed Mabel to live with them with open arms, declaring that he wouldn't have it any other way. "I reckon I'm ready for that drink now." Jake strode toward them, wiping the sweat from his brow, and Gabriel joined them. "I've laid out a picnic under the tree." Mabel waved to them, and Eve took Gabriel's hand, holding him back slightly as the others went ahead. Gabe put his arm around Eve, kissing her tenderly. "I can hardly believe how much my life has changed in just over a year. A double wedding with Jake and Vanessa, married to the most wonderful woman I've ever known, and a new home for us. We have so much to be grateful for, Eve." "We certainly do. We've been blessed in so many ways." Her eyes twinkled as she looked up at him. "I think it might be time for another wedding before much longer, too." She jerked her head toward the young carpenter who had just accepted a glass of lemonade from Mabel, noticing the way her sister's laugh carried on the breeze as he said something to her. "Mrs. Fenton told me that George has taken to calling for Mabel. You'll have to make sure his intentions are honorable." "You can bet I will," Gabe said firmly. "I know George, though. He's a good sort of fellow. If they can be as happy as we are, that's all I would wish for." "You sound just like a protective father," Eve replied with a chuckle. "You know I think of Mabel as my own family, and I only want the best for her." Eve nestled against Gabe as they watched the first pieces of the roof taking shape. "Our very own home," Gabe said quietly, with wonder in his voice. "We'll have a seat on the veranda, where we'll sit and watch the sun setting over the mountains, and our children will play in the meadow. It's everything I ever wanted for us from the moment I realized I was in love with you." "I'm glad you mentioned about the children playing in the meadow," Eve said, giving him a secretive smile. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him gently before glancing down at the slight swell of her belly under her apron. "I reckon by next spring you'll need to build me a crib, Gabe. I've suspected for a few weeks, but as it's our anniversary, today seemed like the perfect time to tell you we're having a baby." "A baby?" Gabe grinned and drew her into an embrace. "Ma's gonna be tickled pink, and Jake told me he and Vanessa have news as well, which can only mean one thing. Sunnybrook Ranch is going to get a whole lot busier," Eve said happily. "Let's go and tell the others." They strolled over to the shade of the tree, where their family and friends were already enjoying the picnic. "Gabe and I have something to tell you all," she said. "And so do Jake and I," Vanessa echoed, giving Eve a heartfelt smile. "Is it what I think?" Anne clasped her hands together as Eve and Vanessa both nodded. "Did you hear that, Frank? We're going to have 2 new grandchildren. Praise the Lord. What a wonderful day this is." The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.